Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. What you're about to hear happened to a trucker named Ronan Keltner during an ice storm that turned a routine delivery into something he still can't fully explain. Before we get into it, I need to tell you that Ronan isn't the kind of guy who spooks easily. He'd been driving cross-country for almost 20 years, hauling everything from electronics to lumber across some of the most brutal winter conditions the northern states could throw at him. This was a man who'd driven through whiteouts where you couldn't see 5 feet in front of your hood, who'd navigated black ice on mountain passes at 3 in the morning, who'd pulled over to help stranded motorists in minus 30-degree weather without a second thought. But what happened to Ronan on Interstate 94 through North Dakota in February of 2023 was different from any weather emergency he'd ever faced. It wasn't the ice that got to him. It wasn't the wind that made his trailer sway like a pendulum. It was something else entirely, something that made him question whether the roads we drive every day are always the same roads, or if sometimes they lead to places that shouldn't exist. Ronan was hauling agricultural equipment from Minnesota to Montana, running about 4 hours behind schedule because of weather delays at the distribution center. The ice storm had been building all day, one of those nasty February systems that rolls across the plains and turns everything into a skating rink. By the time Ronan merged onto I-94 westbound just past Fargo, the temperature had dropped to 8 degrees, and freezing rain was coating the highway in layers of transparent death. He'd chained up before leaving the truck stop, double-checked his load securement, and called his wife to let her know he'd be taking it slow. Ronan was cautious, professional, the kind of driver who understood that getting home alive was more important than making good time. His plan was to cruise at about 40 miles per hour, stay in the right lane, and keep plenty of distance between himself and any other traffic stupid enough to be out in these conditions. The thing was, there wasn't much other traffic. By 9 o'clock that night, Ronan hadn't seen another vehicle for almost 30 miles. No trucks, no cars, not even a highway patrol cruiser. The road was empty except for the ice and the darkness and the wind that howled across the flat farmland on both sides of the interstate. His headlights cut through the freezing rain, creating a tunnel of light that seemed to be the only illumination in the entire world. That's when Ronan first noticed the mile marker. It appeared in his headlights like any other marker would, a green reflective sign on a metal post showing the number 127. Nothing unusual about that. He'd driven this stretch of I-94 dozens of times and knew the markers well enough. Mile marker 127 meant he was about halfway between Fargo and Bismarck, right in the heart of absolutely nowhere. But as Ronan continued driving west at his steady 40 miles per hour, he started to get a strange feeling. The landscape around him wasn't changing the way it should. He'd been watching a distinctive cluster of grain silos off to his right, maybe a quarter mile from the highway. Those silos should have disappeared behind him after a minute or two of driving. Instead, they seemed to be keeping pace with his truck, staying at the same distance no matter how far he traveled. Ronan shook his head and blamed it on the weather conditions. Ice storms could play tricks on your depth perception, make distances seem different than they actually were. He focused on the road ahead and tried to ignore the silos, but then he saw the mile marker again. Mile marker 127, appearing in his headlights exactly as it had before. Same green reflective surface, same metal post, same number. He checked his odometer. According to the trip meter, he'd traveled 2.3 miles since he first saw marker 127. But here it was again, or at least another marker with the same number. Ronan slowed down even more, down to about 30 miles per hour, and studied the marker as he passed it. There was nothing unusual about it, Nothing that would explain why he was seeing it twice. Maybe it was a mistake by the highway department, Ronan thought. Maybe someone had installed 2 markers with the same number by accident. It happened sometimes. Bureaucratic errors that created duplicate signs. But as Ronan continued driving, he saw the marker again. And again. Every time his trip meter showed he'd traveled about 2 miles, mile marker 127 would appear in his headlights. Ronan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. This wasn't right. This wasn't a bureaucratic error. He'd driven this highway enough times to know that the mile markers were properly spaced and correctly numbered. Something else was happening, something that didn't follow the normal rules of distance and geography. He tried his CB radio, cycling through the channels to see if there were any other drivers in the area. Channel 19 was usually busy even in the middle of the night. Truckers talking about weather conditions and road hazards and truck stop coffee. But tonight the radio was completely silent except for occasional bursts of static that almost sounded like voices if you listened close enough. Ronan keyed his microphone. This is westbound driver at mile marker 127 on I-94 in North Dakota. Anyone out there copy? Nothing but static. He tried again on channel 17, then channel 9. Same result. It was as if every other driver in the world had simply vanished, leaving Ronan alone on an empty highway that led nowhere. That's when Ronan noticed the exit sign. It appeared suddenly in his headlights, one of those small blue signs that indicates a rest area or service road. The sign showed an arrow pointing to the right and the words, "Scenic Overlook, 1 mile." Ronan had driven this stretch of I-94 countless times and had never seen a scenic overlook anywhere near mile marker 127. This was flat farmland, nothing scenic about it. No reason for an overlook. But the sign was there, as real and solid as any other highway sign. Ronan's first instinct was to ignore it and keep driving. But as he approached what should have been the exit ramp, he saw something that made him reconsider. There were tire tracks in the fresh ice and snow, recent tracks that led from the highway onto the exit ramp. Someone else had taken this exit within the past hour or 2, recently enough that the tracks hadn't been completely covered by the falling ice. Ronan made a decision that he would question for the rest of his life. He turned onto the exit ramp, following the tire tracks. Maybe whoever made those tracks had found a place to wait out the storm. Maybe there was a rest area or a truck stop that Ronan had somehow forgotten about. Or maybe, and this thought made his stomach tighten, there was someone in trouble who had taken this exit looking for help. The exit ramp curved to the right, leading away from the interstate and into darkness. Ronan's headlights showed a 2-lane road that had been recently plowed, the snow and ice pushed to the sides in neat banks. The road surface was still treacherous, but it was passable. The tire tracks continued ahead, leading deeper into the darkness. Ronan drove slowly, watching his mirrors to keep the interstate in view. But as the exit ramp curved, the highway disappeared behind him, hidden by the terrain and the curtain of freezing rain. Within a minute, Ronan couldn't see the interstate at all. He was on a road that didn't appear on any map, following tire tracks that might belong to another lost driver, or might belong to something else entirely. The road continued for about 2 miles, winding through farmland that looked wrong in the glow of Ronan's headlights. The fields were covered in ice and dead vegetation, but there was something off about the patterns. The furrows in the fields didn't run in straight lines like they should. Instead, they curved and spiraled in ways that made no agricultural sense. The fence posts along the road were tilted at odd angles, as if the ground beneath them had shifted or settled unevenly. Then, Ronan saw the building. It appeared suddenly as he crested a small hill, a structure that looked like a combination of a rest area and a small truck stop. There was a parking lot with space for maybe a dozen trucks, a single-story building with large windows that showed light inside, and even a fuel island with 2 pumps. The whole place was lit up like it was open for business, warm light spilling out onto the ice-covered parking lot. But something about it felt wrong from the moment Ronan saw it. The building looked old, not just weathered, but actually outdated. The architecture was wrong for a modern rest area, more like something from the 1970s or early 1980s. The fuel pumps were old too, the kind with mechanical number wheels instead of digital displays. And the trucks in the parking lot were all older models, the kind you didn't see much on the road anymore. Ronan had pulled into the parking lot slowly, his years of experience making him cautious. He counted 5 trucks parked in various spots, all of them covered in a thick layer of ice that suggested they'd been sitting there for a while. None of them had their running lights on, and Ronan couldn't see any movement inside the cabs. The trucks looked abandoned, but recent enough that they couldn't have been sitting there for more than a few hours. He parked his rig near the entrance to the building and sat for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told him to turn around and find his way back to the interstate. But the storm was getting worse, the wind rocking his trailer despite the chains and the weight of his cargo. If this was a real rest area, it might be the smart play to wait out the worst of the storm before continuing. Ronan grabbed his flashlight and his CB radio handset, then climbed down from his cab. The cold hit him immediately, a brutal wind that carried needles of ice and cut through his heavy jacket like it wasn't there. He pulled his hood up and made his way toward the building, his boots crunching on the ice-covered asphalt. The front door was unlocked. Ronan pushed it open and stepped into warmth and light. The interior of the building looked like a time capsule from 30 or 40 years ago. There was a small convenience store section with wire rack shelves stocked with snacks and drinks, a coffee station with one of those old percolator machines, and a seating area with plastic chairs and tables that looked like they came from a 1980s cafeteria. But there was no one inside. No clerk behind the counter, no truckers drinking coffee in the seating area, no one at all. The lights were on, the coffee was brewing and filling the air with a fresh aroma, but the place was completely empty. It was as if everyone had just stepped away for a moment and would be right back. Ronan called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" His voice echoed in the empty space, but there was no response. He walked through the building, checking the restrooms and a small office area behind the counter. Everything was clean and maintained, but there was no sign of any people. That's when Ronan noticed the details that didn't add up. The products on the shelves were all brands that still existed, but the packaging was old. The candy bars had wrapper designs that had been discontinued years ago. The sodas in the cooler were in bottles that hadn't been used since the 1990s. The magazines on a small rack near the counter had dates from February of 1987. Ronan picked up one of the magazines, a trucking industry publication. The cover showed a new model truck being introduced that year, a truck that Ronan remembered seeing on the roads when he first started driving. The magazine felt real, the pages crisp and the ink still bright. It wasn't some ancient artifact that had been sitting here for decades. It felt fresh, as if it had just been delivered. He set the magazine down and walked to the coffee station. The coffee in the pot was hot and fresh, steam rising from the surface. Ronan poured himself a cup and tasted it. It was good coffee, better than the usual truck stop swill. But the whole situation was so strange that even good coffee couldn't make him relax. Ronan decided to check on the other trucks in the parking lot. Maybe the drivers were sleeping in their cabs, waiting out the storm. He walked back outside into the brutal cold and made his way to the nearest truck, an older Peterbilt that looked like it had been built in the late 1980s. The cab was dark, but Ronan could see through the windows well enough to tell that it was empty. He checked the other trucks one by one. All of them were empty, all of them covered in ice, all of them sitting silent with their engines off. The cabs were locked, but Ronan could see enough through the windows to know that there were no drivers sleeping inside. The trucks had been abandoned, or their drivers had gone somewhere that Ronan couldn't find. As Ronan was checking the last truck, a freightliner with Montana plates, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There was a logbook lying on the dashboard, visible through the windshield. The logbook was open to a page dated February 14, 1987. Today's date was February 14, 2023. Exactly 36 years later to the day. Ronan stood in the ice and wind, staring at that logbook and trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This truck, like all the others in the lot, looked like it had been parked recently. The ice coating the windshield was fresh, maybe a few hours old at most. But the logbook showed a date from 36 years ago. He pulled out his phone to take a picture of the logbook through the windshield, but his phone had no signal. Not unusual in rural North Dakota, but frustrating. He tried his CB radio again, keying the microphone and calling for anyone who might be listening. All he got was static, and underneath the static, something that might have been voices but was too distorted to understand. Ronan made his way back to his own truck, moving quickly through the cold. He climbed into his cab and locked the doors, then sat for a moment trying to warm up and think through his situation. He'd found a rest area that didn't appear on any map, filled with trucks that looked like they'd been parked recently but showed evidence of being from decades ago. The building was open and maintained but completely empty of people. The smart thing to do was leave immediately and find his way back to the interstate. But as Ronan started his engine and prepared to pull out of the parking lot, he realized he had a problem. The road he'd taken to get here had curved and twisted enough that he wasn't entirely sure which direction led back to the highway. In the darkness and the storm, with no visible landmarks and no GPS signal, it would be easy to head the wrong direction and get even more lost. Ronan decided to wait until daylight, or at least until the storm eased up enough that he could see more than 50 feet. He shut down his engine to conserve fuel and settled into his sleeper berth with a sleeping bag and his emergency supplies. Through his windshield, he could see the rest area building, its lights still burning bright in the darkness. As Ronan tried to rest, he became aware of sounds outside his truck. At first, he thought it was just the wind and the ice, the normal sounds of a winter storm. But as he listened more carefully, he realized the sounds were too regular, too purposeful. It sounded like footsteps, multiple sets of footsteps, crunching through the ice and snow around his truck. Ronan sat up and looked out his windows, but he couldn't see anyone. The parking lot was as empty as before, just his truck and the 5 abandoned vehicles. But the footsteps continued, circling his truck slowly. Sometimes they would stop at his door, and Ronan would hold his breath, waiting for a knock that never came. Then the footsteps would resume, moving around to the other side of his truck. This continued for what felt like hours. Ronan sat in his sleeper berth, listening to invisible footsteps circle his truck in the darkness. He kept his CB radio on, listening for any sign of other drivers, but all he heard was static and the occasional burst of what sounded like voices speaking in a language he couldn't identify. Around what Ronan estimated to be 4 in the morning, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound of movement. Ronan waited, listening, but there was nothing except the wind and the creaking of ice-covered metal. That's when his CB radio crackled to life with a voice that was clear and distinct, cutting through the static like a knife. "Westbound driver in the lot, you shouldn't be here. This place isn't for the living. Get back to the highway while you still can." Ronan grabbed his microphone. "Who is this? Where are you?" But the radio had gone silent again, offering nothing but static in response. He tried several more times to raise whoever had spoken, but there was no answer. The voice had mentioned getting back to the highway, which suggested there was a way out of this place. Ronan decided he wasn't waiting for daylight. He fired up his engine, turned on all his lights, and pulled out of the parking lot. He chose the road that seemed most likely to lead back to the interstate, even though in the darkness and storm it was mostly guesswork. As Ronan drove away from the rest area, he looked in his mirrors and saw something that would haunt him. The building's lights were going out one by one, as if someone was walking through flipping switches. Within seconds, the entire place was dark. And in that moment, before the last light went out, Ronan thought he saw figures standing in the windows, dozens of them, all watching his truck drive away into the night. Ronan drove through the darkness with his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had gone white. The road ahead looked different now. Or maybe it had always looked this way and he just hadn't noticed in his eagerness to find shelter. The asphalt was cracked and weathered, with weeds growing through the gaps in a way that suggested years of neglect. The snowbanks on either side were higher than they should be, as if this road hadn't been plowed in a very long time despite the fresh plowing he'd seen when he first arrived. He checked his mirrors compulsively, watching for any sign of the rest area behind him. But the darkness had swallowed it completely. No lights, no building, nothing but the black void of a winter night on the plains. Ronan's speedometer showed he was doing about 35 miles per hour, a reasonable speed for the conditions. But something felt off about the way his truck was moving, as if the road beneath him wasn't quite solid or the laws of physics weren't working the way they should. The road twisted more than Ronan remembered. When he'd driven in, it had been a fairly straight route with just a few gentle curves. Now, it seemed to wind back and forth like a snake, each turn revealing nothing but more darkness and more road ahead. Ronan's fuel gauge showed he'd burned about a quarter tank since leaving the rest area, which was impossible. He should have used maybe a gallon or two at most. After what felt like an hour of driving, Ronan still hadn't found the interstate. The road just kept going, leading him through a landscape that seemed to shift and change every time he looked at it. Sometimes the fields on either side appeared to be covered in fresh snow. Other times they looked like they'd been burned or poisoned, the ground black and dead beneath the ice. Ronan told himself it was just the storm playing tricks with his perception, but he knew better. Something was very wrong with this road. That's when Ronan's headlights caught something that made him hit the brakes hard enough to make his trailer slide slightly on the ice. There was a truck stopped in the middle of the road ahead, a big rig that looked like it had been there for a while. The truck was covered in ice, but underneath the coating Ronan could see it was an older Kenworth, probably from the mid-1980s based on the body style. Ronan pulled up behind the truck slowly, his hazard lights flashing. He grabbed his flashlight and climbed down from his cab, moving carefully on the slippery road surface. The cold was brutal, the kind of cold that makes your lungs hurt when you breathe and turns exposed skin numb within seconds. Ronan pulled his face mask up and approached the Kenworth cautiously. The truck's engine was off, the cab dark and silent. Ronan could see through the ice-covered windows well enough to tell that there was no one inside. But what caught his attention was the condition of the truck itself. The ice coating wasn't fresh like the ice on the trucks at the rest area. This was old ice, thick and crystalline, the kind that forms over days or weeks of exposure to sub-freezing temperatures. Ronan walked around the truck, his flashlight beam cutting through the falling snow and ice. The trailer was a standard dry van, its doors closed and sealed. The license plate was from North Dakota, but the registration tags were expired. According to the little sticker on the plate, they'd expired in February of 1987. Ronan tried the driver's door and found it unlocked. He pulled it open with some effort, the ice cracking and falling away in chunks. The interior of the cab was frozen solid, frost covering every surface in elaborate crystalline patterns. The seats were stiff with cold, the dashboard glazed with ice. But what made Ronan's stomach drop was what he found sitting on the passenger seat. It was a logbook, opened to a page that showed entries for February 13th and 14th of 1987. The handwriting was neat and precise, each entry carefully documenting miles traveled and time spent driving. The last entry was dated February 14th, 1987 at 11:47 p.m. The location was listed as mile marker 127, I-94 westbound. The note section said simply, "Found scenic overlook exit, taking shelter from storm." Ronan's hands were shaking as he photographed the logbook page with his phone, even though he still had no signal. He needed evidence of this, something to prove he wasn't losing his mind. The date, the location, the note about the scenic overlook. It all matched his own experience exactly. But this logbook was from 36 years ago. Ronan looked more carefully around the cab and found other items that told a story. There was a thermos in the cup holder, frozen solid. A CB radio microphone hanging from its clip, the cord stiff with ice. A family photo tucked into the sun visor, showing a man in his 30s with a woman and 2 young children. The photo was faded but still visible beneath a layer of frost. On the dashboard, partially covered by ice, was a business card. Ronan carefully scraped away the frost and read the name printed there. Dalton Cresthaven, Independent Hauler. There was a phone number with a North Dakota area code and an address in Bismarck. Ronan climbed down from the Kenworth and stood in the road, trying to process what he'd found. This truck had been here since 1987, or at least the evidence suggested it had. The driver, presumably Dalton Cresthaven, had taken the same exit Ronan had taken, found the same rest area, and then somehow ended up abandoned on this road with no explanation for where he'd gone. Ronan tried his CB radio again, keying the microphone with numb fingers. "This is westbound driver on service road near mile marker 127. I've found an abandoned truck, older Kenworth. Appears to have been here for a long time. If anyone can hear me, I need information about a driver named Dalton Cresthaven. Please respond." The static on the radio shifted and changed, and for a moment Ronan thought he heard voices. They were faint and distorted, like they were coming from very far away, or from a different time entirely. He strained to make out the words, but they were just beyond comprehension. Then suddenly a voice came through clearly. "Ronan Keltner." The voice knew his name. It was a woman's voice, professional and calm, with the slight accent of someone who'd grown up in the upper Midwest. "This is Highway Patrol Dispatch. We've been trying to reach you. What is your current location?" Ronan felt a surge of relief wash over him. Finally, contact with the outside world. "Dispatch, this is Ronan Keltner. I'm on a service road somewhere near mile marker 127 on I-94. I took an exit for a scenic overlook during the ice storm, and I've been trying to find my way back to the highway. I found an abandoned truck here, a Kenworth that appears to have been sitting for a very long time." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that Ronan wondered if he'd lost the connection. Then the voice came back, and this time it sounded different somehow. Less certain, more careful. "Ronan, we don't show any service roads or scenic overlooks near mile marker 127. Can you describe what you're seeing around you?" Ronan looked around at the dark landscape, the ice-covered road, the abandoned Kenworth sitting silent in his headlights. "I'm on a 2-lane road, paved but in poor condition, heavy ice and snow. I found a rest area about an hour ago, looked like it was from the 1980s. Now I'm on this road trying to find the interstate, and I've come across this abandoned truck." Another long pause. When the dispatcher spoke again, her voice had taken on a tone that Ronan couldn't quite identify. Concern, maybe, or something deeper than that. "Ronan, I need you to listen to me carefully. My name is Maeve Lorigan. I'm the senior dispatcher for this district, and I've been doing this job for 15 years. We get calls like yours maybe once every few years. drivers who take an exit near mile marker 127 and find themselves on roads that don't exist on any map. Ronan's throat went dry. What do you mean, roads that don't exist? I mean exactly that. Maeve's voice was steady, professional, but Ronan could hear the undercurrent of something else. The scenic overlook exit you took hasn't existed since the highway department closed it in 1987. There was a rest area there, exactly like you described, but it was demolished over 30 years ago after several drivers disappeared in the area. The exit ramp was removed, the road was torn up, and the whole area was fenced off. Ronan looked at the abandoned Kenworth in front of him, at the logbook entry dated February 14, 1987. The pieces were starting to come together in a way that made his skin crawl. The truck I found belongs to someone named Dalton Cresthaven. According to his logbook, he took the scenic overlook exit on February 14, 1987. That was the last entry. The silence on the other end of the radio lasted so long that Ronan thought he'd lost the connection again. When Maeve spoke, her voice was quiet, almost reverent. Dalton Cresthaven was one of the drivers who disappeared. His truck was never found. The investigation concluded that he'd probably gone off the road during the ice storm and ended up in a location where the wreckage couldn't be seen from the highway. But they searched for weeks and never found anything. Ronan felt the cold seeping deeper into his bones, and it had nothing to do with the temperature outside his truck. Maeve, I'm looking at his truck right now. I'm looking at his logbook. He's not here, but the truck is. And I need to know how to get out of here before whatever happened to him happens to me. Listen to me very carefully, Ronan. Maeve's voice had taken on an urgency that cut through the static and the wind. Every driver who's called in from that area has described the same things you're seeing. The rest area that shouldn't exist. The abandoned trucks. The roads that lead nowhere. Most of them find their way back to the interstate eventually. But not all of them. And the ones who don't come back, we never find their trucks either. So, what do I do? Ronan heard the edge of panic in his own voice and fought to control it. Panic got you killed on the road. Staying calm, thinking clearly, that's what kept you alive. The drivers who made it back all said the same thing. Maeve's words came slowly, as if she was choosing them very carefully. They stopped trying to find the interstate, and instead followed the road wherever it led. Eventually, they found their way back. It's like the road wants you to complete a journey before it lets you leave. I know that sounds crazy, but it's the only consistent pattern we've found. Ronan looked at the road stretching ahead into darkness, then back at Dalton Cresthaven's frozen truck. And what about the drivers who didn't make it back? What happened to them? We don't know. Maeve's voice was heavy with something that sounded like guilt or grief. The official reports say they probably crashed somewhere remote, and the wreckage was never found. But off the record, between you and me, I think they're still out there. Still driving on roads that don't exist, trying to find their way home. Ronan closed his eyes for a moment, fighting back the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. When he opened them again, he'd made a decision. Okay, I'm going to keep driving forward. If this road wants me to complete a journey, I'll complete it. But Maeve, I need you to stay on this channel. I need to know someone out there knows where I am, even if it's a place that shouldn't exist. I'll be here, Ronan. I'm not going anywhere. There was a warmth in Maeve's voice that gave Ronan a small measure of comfort. And Ronan, every driver who's made it back said the same thing. Don't stop. Don't leave your truck. And whatever you see or hear out there, remember that it's not real. It's just the road playing tricks. Ronan wanted to ask what kind of tricks she meant, but he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Instead, he climbed back into his cab, fired up his engine, and started driving again. He maneuvered carefully around Dalton Cresthaven's Kenworth, noting as he passed that his own tire tracks were the only fresh marks on the road. No one else had driven this route in a very long time. The road continued to wind through the darkness, and Ronan followed it with grim determination. His fuel gauge was dropping faster than it should, showing he was down to half a tank despite the relatively short distance he'd traveled. Ronan made a mental note to watch his fuel carefully. Running out of gas on this phantom road would be a death sentence. As he drove, Ronan started noticing other things wrong with the landscape around him. The fence posts along the roadside weren't just tilted. They were bent at angles that suggested enormous force had pushed them over. Some of them had been driven into the ground upside down, the pointed tops buried in the frozen earth while the bases stuck up in the air. Trees in the distance seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them, their positions shifting slightly each time he glanced their way. Ronan kept up a steady dialogue with Maeve on the CB, describing everything he saw. She didn't offer explanations, just listened and acknowledged his reports. It helped to have another human voice to focus on, something to anchor him to reality when everything around him seemed to be slipping into something else entirely. "I'm seeing another vehicle ahead," Ronan reported after about 30 minutes of driving. His headlights had picked up the shape of a truck parked on the side of the road. This one looked more recent than Dalton Cresthaven's Kenworth, maybe from the early 2000s based on the body style. It's a freightliner. Looks like it's been here a few years, but not decades. "Don't stop to investigate." Maeve's voice was sharp with warning. The drivers who made it back said they kept moving forward no matter what they saw. The ones who stopped to investigate, to check on other vehicles or try to help, those are the ones who didn't come home. Ronan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He drove past the freightliner without slowing, but he couldn't help looking as he passed. The truck was empty, covered in ice, and there was a figure standing next to it. The figure was motionless, just standing there in the freezing wind and ice like a statue. Ronan couldn't make out any details in the darkness, but he could see enough to know it was human-shaped, and it was watching his truck drive by. There was someone standing by that truck, Ronan said quietly into his microphone. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, tight with fear he was trying to control. "I know." Maeve's response was immediate. "They're not real, Ronan. They're just part of the road. Part of whatever this place is. Keep driving." Ronan kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead and his foot steady on the accelerator. In his mirrors, he could see the figure was still standing there, watching. Then, as the distance between them grew, the figure began to move. It started walking toward the road, toward the path Ronan's truck had just traveled. Its movements were slow and deliberate, like someone wading through deep water. "It's following me," Ronan reported, fighting to keep his voice level. "The figure by the freightliner, it's walking onto the road behind me." "Don't look back," Maeve said firmly. "Focus on what's ahead. The road will try to distract you, try to make you stop or turn around. You have to keep moving forward." Ronan forced himself to look away from his mirrors and concentrate on the road ahead. His truck's systems were all functioning normally, the engine running smooth despite the cold and the bizarre circumstances. Whatever was happening to him, it wasn't affecting his truck's mechanical systems. That was something to hold on to, a piece of normality in a situation that was anything but normal. The road began to climb, rising up a long grade that shouldn't have existed on the flat North Dakota plains. Ronan shifted down and his engine growled as it pulled the heavy trailer up the incline. At the top of the grade, he could see lights in the distance. Not the harsh white of modern LED streetlights, but the softer yellow glow of older sodium vapor lamps. "I see lights ahead," Ronan reported. "Looks like it might be a town or another truck stop." "Describe what you see," Maeve's voice was tense with anticipation or worry. Ronan squinted through his windshield as he crested the hill and got a better view. It's a small town, maybe a dozen buildings. Old-style architecture looks like something from the 1950s or 60s. Main street layout with buildings on both sides of the road. The lights are on, but I don't see any movement, no cars, no people. That's good, Maeve said, and Ronan could hear the relief in her voice. Several of the drivers who made it back reported seeing a town. They said they drove straight through without stopping, and shortly after that, they found themselves back on the interstate. You're getting close, Ronan. Just keep going. Ronan's fuel gauge was showing a quarter tank remaining, which worried him. But if Maeve was right about being close to the end of this nightmare, he should have enough to make it. He maintained his speed as he approached the town, his headlights illuminating the old buildings that lined the main street. The town looked like it had been frozen in time. There was a gas station with pumps that had mechanical number wheels instead of digital displays. A diner with a neon sign that flickered in shades of pink and blue. A movie theater marquee advertising films that Ronan vaguely remembered from his childhood. Everything looked real and solid, but there was no one there. The streets were empty, the buildings dark despite the lights that burned in their windows. As Ronan drove through the town, he noticed details that made his skin crawl. The cars parked along the main street were all from the same era as the buildings, models from the 1950s and 60s. But they were covered in ice and snow, abandoned just like the trucks he'd seen on the road. The storefronts displayed merchandise that looked fresh and new, but when Ronan looked closer he could see that everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if it had been sitting untouched for decades. "I'm in the town," Ronan said quietly into his microphone. "It's like a ghost town, everything here but no people. The buildings look maintained but abandoned." "Keep driving," Maeve urged. "Don't stop, don't get out of your truck, just pass through and keep going." Ronan was halfway through the town when he saw movement. A door to the diner opened, and figures began emerging onto the street. They moved slowly, purposefully, spreading out to block the road ahead. Ronan counted at least a dozen of them, all wearing clothing from different eras. Some were dressed in the style of the 1950s, others in the fashion of the 1980s, and a few in more recent clothing. "There are people blocking the road," Ronan reported, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "They're standing in the street, not moving out of the way. Drive through them." Maeve's voice was hard and urgent. "Don't slow down. Don't swerve. They're not real. Drive straight through and don't look back." Ronan's every instinct screamed at him not to drive into a crowd of people, but he remembered Maeve's words about the road playing tricks, about nothing here being real. He kept his foot steady on the accelerator and his hands firm on the wheel as his truck bore down on the figures blocking the road. At the last second, just as Ronan's bumper was about to hit the first figure, they all disappeared. One moment they were solid and real, the next they were gone like smoke. Ronan drove through the empty space where they'd been standing and kept going, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "They're gone," Ronan said, his voice shaking despite his efforts to control it. "They just vanished when I got close." "Good. You did exactly right." Maeve sounded like she'd been holding her breath and had just exhaled. "How's your fuel?" Ronan glanced at his gauge. "Quarter tank and dropping. I'm using fuel way faster than I should be." "You're almost there," Maeve assured him. The other drivers said the town was the last thing they saw before they found the interstate again. Just keep your speed steady and keep driving west. Ronan left the ghost town behind and found himself on a road that looked more normal than anything he'd seen since taking that exit. The asphalt was in good condition. The lane markings were visible despite the snow, and the landscape on either side looked like actual North Dakota farmland, instead of the twisted nightmare version he'd been driving through. His fuel gauge showed less than an eighth of a tank remaining when Ronan saw the most beautiful sight he'd ever witnessed. Ahead in the distance, illuminated by the first hints of dawn breaking over the horizon, was Interstate 94. Real, solid, unmistakable I-94 with its wide lanes and green mile marker signs. "I see it," Ronan said into his microphone, his voice thick with emotion. "I can see the interstate." "Then get to it and don't look back," Maeve ordered. "And Ronan, when you get back on I-94, you're going to be at mile marker 159. Don't ask me how or why. Just accept it and keep driving west toward your delivery." Ronan's truck climbed the entrance ramp and merged onto I-94 westbound. The moment his tires hit the interstate, everything changed. His fuel gauge jumped back up to showing 3/4 of a tank. His GPS came back online, displaying his location at mile marker 159, just like Maeve had said. And his CB radio, which had been silent except for Maeve's voice for hours, suddenly came alive with the normal chatter of truckers discussing road conditions and weather. "I'm on the interstate," Ronan reported to Maeve. "Everything's back to normal. My fuel gauge, my GPS, everything." "I know," Maeve said softly. "I'm showing you on our tracking system now. You're exactly where you should be, right on schedule for your delivery to Montana." Ronan wanted to ask how that was possible, how he'd spent hours on that phantom road and somehow hadn't lost any time at all. But he was too exhausted, too overwhelmed to process it right now. Instead, he asked, "Maeve, does this happen often? Drivers taking that exit and getting lost on roads that don't exist?" "Once every few years," Maeve replied. "Like I said, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and you're the 7th driver I've talked through it. Most make it back. A few don't. And Ronan, you should know that officially, this conversation never happened. There's no record of you calling in, no record of us talking. The highway department doesn't acknowledge that the scenic overlook exit still exists in any form. But it does exist," Ronan said quietly. "I was there. I saw Dalton Cresthaven's truck." "I know." Maeve's voice was heavy with something that sounded like grief. "Believe me, I know. But officially, none of it exists. Just be grateful you made it back and try to forget about what you saw out there." Ronan knew he'd never forget. How could he? But he also understood what Maeve was really saying. Some things couldn't be explained or documented, and trying to make sense of them would only drive you crazy. "Thank you, Maeve, for staying on the line, for talking me through it. I don't think I would have made it without you." "Just doing my job," Maeve said, but Ronan could hear the warmth in her voice. "Now get that delivery to Montana and drive safe. And Ronan, if you ever drive through this area again and you see that scenic overlook exit, just keep driving. Don't take it, no matter what. Don't worry," Ronan said with absolute certainty. "I learned my lesson." The radio went silent after that, and Ronan settled into the familiar rhythm of the long-haul driving. The sun was coming up over the plains, painting the ice-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that looked clean and new and, most importantly, real. Ronan made it to Montana and completed his delivery without incident. The customer was happy with the on-time arrival. His dispatcher was pleased with his performance, and on paper everything looked exactly as it should. But Ronan couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed during those hours on the Phantom Road. He felt different somehow, like he'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. The drive back east took him through the same stretch of I-94 where he'd taken that scenic overlook exit. Ronan watched his odometer carefully as he approached mile marker 127, his hands tight on the steering wheel and his eyes scanning the roadside for any sign of that exit ramp. but there was nothing there. Just empty prairie on both sides of the highway, covered in snow and ice, with no indication that a road had ever existed in that location. Ronan tried to convince himself that the whole experience had been some kind of hallucination, brought on by exhaustion and storm conditions. Maybe he'd fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the entire thing. Maybe the stress of driving in an ice storm had caused him to have some kind of break from reality. But the memory was too vivid, too detailed to be just a dream. And there was the matter of Maeve Lorigan and their conversation on the CB radio. When Ronan got home to Minnesota, he spent hours searching online for information about Dalton Cresthaven. What he found made his blood run cold. There were newspaper articles from February 1987 about a trucker who had disappeared during an ice storm on I-94 in North Dakota. Dalton Cresthaven, 34 years old, married with 2 children, had been driving from Minnesota to Montana when he vanished without a trace. The articles described an extensive search effort that lasted for weeks. Law enforcement, volunteers, and even aerial surveys had covered hundreds of square miles looking for any sign of Cresthaven or his truck. The prevailing theory was that he'd gone off the road during the storm and ended up in a ravine or depression where the wreckage couldn't be easily spotted, but they never found anything. No truck, no body, no evidence of what had happened to him. What made Ronan's hands shake as he read the articles was a quote from Cresthaven's wife. She said that Dalton had called her on his CB radio during the storm, said he'd found a rest area to wait out the worst of the weather. That was the last anyone heard from him. The rest area he'd described didn't match any known facilities in the area, and investigators had concluded he must have been confused or disoriented by the storm conditions. Ronan printed out the articles and added them to a folder he was building. He also searched for information about the scenic overlook exit and the rest area that Maeve had mentioned. Official Highway Department records showed that an exit had indeed existed at mile marker 127, installed in the early 1970s to provide access to a scenic overlook and small rest facility. But the exit had been permanently closed in February of 1987 due to safety concerns and what the records vaguely described as recurring incidents. The rest area had been demolished shortly after the closure, and the exit ramp had been removed and the land restored to its natural state. According to the official records, the area had been fenced off and was now considered part of a protected wildlife corridor. But Ronan had been there. He'd driven on that road, seen that rest area, touched the frozen logbook in Dalton Cresthaven's truck. It hadn't been a hallucination or a dream. Ronan tried to contact Maeve Lorigan at the North Dakota Highway Patrol, but when he called the dispatch center and asked for her by name, the supervisor who answered said there was no one by that name working there. Ronan described her voice, her position as senior dispatcher, her 15 years of experience. The supervisor was polite but firm. They'd never had a dispatcher named Maeve Lorigan, and they only had 3 dispatchers total, none of whom matched the description Ronan provided. That's when Ronan started to wonder if Maeve had been real at all. Maybe she was part of the Phantom Road, another trick designed to guide lost drivers back to reality. Or maybe she was something else entirely, a presence that existed in that space between the real highway and the impossible roads that branched off from it. Either way, Ronan owed her his life, and he'd never be able to thank her properly. Ronan returned to work, but he found himself constantly thinking about what he'd experienced. He started paying attention to trucker forums and message boards, looking for others who might have had similar encounters. What he found was both reassuring and disturbing. There were dozens of reports from drivers who claimed to have taken exits that didn't exist, found rest areas that weren't on any map, or driven on roads that led to impossible places. Most of these reports were dismissed as tall tales, or the result of drivers falling asleep at the wheel and having vivid dreams. But Ronan could read between the lines and recognize the authentic accounts from the made-up stories. The real ones had details that matched his own experience. The sense of time being wrong, the abandoned trucks from different eras, the feeling that the road wanted something from you before it would let you go. Ronan started contributing to these discussions, carefully sharing his own story without revealing too many details. He wanted to connect with other drivers who'd been through the same thing, to confirm that he wasn't alone in this experience. The responses he got were mixed. Some people thought he was making it up for attention. Others shared their own stories of impossible roads and phantom exits. And a few warned him to stop talking about it, to forget what he'd seen and move on with his life. One message in particular caught Ronan's attention. It came from someone using the screen name NightDriver87, and it was sent as a private message rather than posted on the public forum. The message was short and direct. "You found Cresthaven's truck. That means you were further in than most. We need to talk. There are things about that road you need to understand before it comes back for you." Ronan stared at that message for a long time before responding. The idea that the road might come back for him was terrifying, but it also made a certain horrible sense. He'd escaped from that place, but had he really? Or had he just been granted a temporary reprieve? Ronan sent a reply asking NightDriver87 to explain what they meant. The response came quickly. NightDriver87 wanted to meet in person at a truck stop in Fargo, North Dakota. The meeting would have to be face-to-face because, as NightDriver87 put it, some things can't be discussed electronically. Ronan agreed to the meeting, driven by a need to understand what had happened to him and what might still be coming. 2 weeks after his experience on the Phantom Road, Ronan found himself sitting in a booth at a truck stop restaurant in Fargo, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the door. Night Driver had said he'd be there at 7 in the evening, and Ronan had arrived 15 minutes early. The truck stop was busy with the usual mix of professional drivers, tourists, and locals grabbing a quick meal. At exactly 7 o'clock, a man walked into the restaurant and looked directly at Ronan's booth. He was in his late 50s with weathered features and the kind of careful, economical movements that came from years of living in truck cabs and adapting to limited space. He walked over to Ronan's booth and slid into the seat across from him without saying a word. "You're Ronan Keltner," the man said. It wasn't a question. "I'm pleased to see you made it back. Not everyone does." Ronan had studied the man across from him. There was something familiar about his eyes, a kind of haunted look that Ronan had started seeing in his own reflection. "You're NightDriver87. You've been on that road too." The man nodded slowly. "More times than I care to count. My name's not important, but you can call me what the others call me. I'm a guide, someone who helps drivers understand what they've experienced and how to protect themselves from going back." Going back? Ronan felt a chill run down his spine. "You mean it could happen again?" The guide leaned forward, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "The Phantom Road doesn't just exist in one place, Ronan. It's like a network, a spiderweb of impossible routes that connect to the real highway system at certain points. Mile marker 127 on I-94 is one of those connection points. There are dozens of others scattered across the country, maybe hundreds. And once you've been on the Phantom Road, it's easier for you to slip back onto it again." Ronan's coffee had gone cold in his cup, but he didn't notice. "How do I prevent that from happening?" "You pay attention." The guide pulled out a small notebook and slid it across the table. "This contains a list of known connection points. Places where the Phantom Road intersects with real highways. You avoid these areas, especially during bad weather or at night. You watch for the signs, exits that don't feel right. Rest areas that seem off somehow. Mile markers that repeat. Ronan opened the notebook and found pages filled with handwritten notes. Highway numbers, mile markers, exit descriptions, all documented in careful detail. There were dozens of locations listed, spread across multiple states. How did you compile all this? From drivers like you. The guide's expression was grim. Drivers who made it back and were willing to share their experiences. Every entry in that book represents someone who survived an encounter with the Phantom Road. But for every survivor, there are probably 2 or 3 drivers who didn't make it back. Drivers like Dalton Cresthaven. I found his truck, Ronan said quietly. I saw his logbook, his last entry. He took the same exit I did. The guide nodded. Cresthaven was one of the early ones before we understood what was happening. Back in the 80s, drivers who took those exits and didn't come back were just listed as missing, presumed dead in weather-related accidents. It wasn't until the late 90s that some of us started to notice the pattern. The connection points, the phantom roads, the trucks that disappeared without a trace. "What is it?" Ronan asked. "What is that place? Is it supernatural, some kind of alternate dimension, what?" The guide was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "We don't know for sure. Some think it's a place where time works differently, where past and present exist simultaneously. Others think it's some kind of trap, a supernatural phenomenon that feeds on lost travelers. I've heard theories involving government experiments, natural anomalies, even alien technology. The truth is, we don't understand it. We just know it exists and that it's dangerous." Ronan thought about the ghost town he'd driven through, the figures that had blocked the road and then vanished. "The things I saw there, were they real? The people, the abandoned trucks, all of it?" "That depends on what you mean by real." The guide leaned back in his booth. "They exist in that space, in that moment. But are they independent entities with their own consciousness, or are they just echoes and shadows created by the road itself? We don't know. What we do know is that interacting with them can be dangerous. Stopping to help, getting out of your truck to investigate, that's when drivers tend not to come back." "Maeve told me the same thing," Ronan said. "The dispatcher who talked me through it. She said to keep driving, don't stop, don't leave the truck." The guide's eyes widened slightly. "Maeve Lorigan? You talked to her? You know her, I know of her." The guide's voice had taken on a note of respect, tinged with something else. Maeve Lorigan was a highway patrol dispatcher in North Dakota. She worked that position from 1971 until 1986. She was known for being one of the best, someone who could talk drivers through any emergency with calm professionalism. But in February of 1987, during the same ice storm that claimed Dalton Cresthaven, Maeve disappeared. Ronan felt the floor drop out from under him. "What do you mean, disappeared?" "She was working her shift at the dispatch center when she took a call from a driver who'd gotten lost near mile marker 127. She stayed on the radio with him for hours, trying to guide him back to the interstate. But something went wrong. The other dispatchers said they could hear her talking, could hear the stress in her voice, but they couldn't make out what she was saying. Then, right in the middle of her shift, Maeve simply stood up and walked out of the dispatch center. She got in her car and drove west on I-94. The guide paused, letting the implications sink in. They found her car 3 days later, parked at mile marker 127 with the engine still running. But Maeve was gone. No sign of her, no indication of what had happened. The official investigation concluded that she'd had some kind of mental breakdown and wandered off into the storm. But the other dispatchers knew better. Maeve had tried to help a driver on the Phantom Road, and somehow that connection had pulled her in. Ronan's hands were shaking. But I talked to her. She helped me. She said she'd been doing the job for 15 years. And she had been when she disappeared. The guide's voice was gentle but firm. Ronan, you didn't talk to Maeve Lorrigan, the person. You talked to whatever Maeve has become in that place. Some kind of echo or spirit or presence that still tries to help lost drivers. Several people who've been on the Phantom Road have reported hearing her voice, receiving her guidance. She's still out there, still trying to do her job, even though she's been gone from the real world for over 35 years. Ronan didn't know what to say. The woman who'd saved his life, who'd talked him through the worst experience of his career, wasn't even alive in any conventional sense. She was trapped on that Phantom Road, serving as a guide for other lost drivers. The thought filled him with a mixture of gratitude and profound sadness. There's something else you need to know, the guide continued. The fact that you found Cresthaven's truck means you went deeper into the Phantom Road than most survivors. Usually, drivers take the exit, find the rest area, get spooked, and manage to find their way back to the interstate fairly quickly. But you drove past the rest area, encountered multiple abandoned vehicles, even passed through the ghost town. That's rare. That's deep. What does that mean for me? It means the road has a stronger claim on you than it does on most survivors. The guide's expression was serious. You're going to need to be extra careful. Watch for the warning signs, changes in your truck's behavior, your GPS showing impossible routes, mile markers that repeat. If you start experiencing any of those things, you need to pull over immediately, shut down your engine, and wait for it to pass. Ronan absorbed this information, adding it to the growing weight of knowledge he wished he didn't have. Is there any way to permanently protect myself? Some kind of ritual or talisman or something? The guide smiled, but there was no humor in it. This isn't a horror movie, Ronan. There's no magic words or holy symbols that'll keep you safe. Your best protection is knowledge and vigilance. Know where the connection points are, avoid them when possible, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong on the road, it probably is. They talked for another hour, with the guide sharing stories of other drivers who'd had similar experiences. Some had multiple encounters with the Phantom Road and learned to navigate it with relative safety. Others had one experience and never drove professionally again. And then there were the ones who disappeared entirely, joining Dalton Cresthaven and countless others in whatever limbo existed on those impossible highways. As the meeting was wrapping up, Ronan asked one final question. Why do you do this? Help drivers like me compile all this information, meet with strangers to warn them. The guide was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. Because I lost someone to that road. My brother, back in '93. He took an exit near mile marker 127 and never came back. I've spent 30 years trying to understand what happened to him, trying to help other drivers avoid the same fate. If I can save even one person from going through what my family went through, then it's worth it. Ronan understood. He thought about his own wife and children, about how close he'd come to disappearing just like the guide's brother. Thank you. For the notebook. For the information. For everything. Just stay safe out there. The guide stood up and offered his hand. Ronan shook it, feeling the calluses and strength of someone who'd spent a lifetime on the road. And Ronan, if you ever encounter another driver who's been on the Phantom Road, help them the way I'm helping you. Pass the knowledge along. It's the only way we can fight back against whatever that place is. After the guide left, Ronan sat in the booth for a long time, studying the notebook he'd been given. Each entry represented a story, a driver who'd brushed up against something impossible and lived to tell about it. Ronan wondered how many of these survivors had changed careers, How many still drove but carried the weight of their experience with them every day? Ronan made a decision that night. He would continue driving, but he would be more careful, more aware. He would avoid the connection points listed in the guide's notebook, and if he encountered another driver who'd had a similar experience, he would offer the same help and understanding that had been given to him. But more than that, Ronan decided he would document his own experience in detail. He spent the next several weeks writing down everything he could remember about his time on the Phantom Road. Every detail, every sensation, every moment of fear and confusion. He recorded the exact location of the exit, the layout of the rest area, the appearance of Dalton Cresthaven's truck, and the conversation with Maeve Lorrigan. Ronan created his own copy of the guide's notebook and started adding to it. He joined multiple trucker forums under different screen names and carefully monitored discussions for any mention of strange roads or impossible exits. When he found accounts that seemed genuine, he reached out to the drivers and shared his own story. Some responded with relief, grateful to find someone who believed them. Others never replied, perhaps deciding it was safer to forget than to remember. 3 months after his experience, Ronan was driving through North Dakota again on a different route. It was a clear spring day, no storms, perfect visibility. But as he approached a certain section of highway, his GPS suddenly flickered and showed a route that didn't match the road ahead. The suggested detour would take him off the interstate onto a county road that his maps showed as being closed for construction. Ronan felt his heart rate spike. This was exactly the kind of warning sign the guide had told him to watch for. He immediately pulled onto the shoulder, shut down his engine, and waited. For the next 10 minutes, he sat in his truck and watched as his GPS continued to suggest the impossible route. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the glitch cleared and his GPS showed the correct road ahead. Ronan sat there for another 5 minutes, making sure the anomaly was truly gone. Then he restarted his engine and continued on his way, his hands slightly shaky on the wheel. The Phantom Road had tried to call him back, but he'd recognized the signs and resisted. It was a small victory, but an important one. That incident convinced Ronan that the guide had been right. The road did have a stronger claim on him now. He would need to be vigilant for the rest of his driving career, always watching for the signs that reality was starting to slip. It was an exhausting way to live, but it was better than the alternative. Ronan also started noticing other trucks on the highway that seemed wrong somehow. Older models that were too well maintained for their age. Drivers who sat perfectly still in their cabs as if they weren't really driving. Mile markers that appeared twice when he wasn't paying close attention. He couldn't be sure if these were genuine anomalies or just his heightened awareness making him see patterns where none existed. But Ronan had learned one crucial lesson from his experience. Trust your instincts. If something felt wrong, even if you couldn't explain why, it was better to be cautious than to ignore that inner warning. The Phantom Road was always out there, always waiting for drivers who weren't paying attention or who thought they were immune to its pull. Late one night, Ronan was parked at a rest area in Montana, taking his mandatory rest break. He was sitting in his cab, reading through the guide's notebook for what must have been the 100th time when his CB radio crackled to life. The voice that came through was familiar, warm and professional with that slight Midwest accent. "Ronan Keltner, this is Maeve Lorrigan. I just wanted to check in. Make sure you're doing all right out there." Ronan grabbed his microphone, his heart pounding. "Maeve, is that really you?" "It's really me, or at least the part of me that still exists in this form." Her voice was tinged with something that sounded like sadness. "I heard you've been talking to the guide, learning about what happened to me. I wanted you to know that I don't regret what I did. Helping drivers like you, that's still my purpose, even if I can't do it the way I used to. "I'm sorry," Ronan said, not sure what else to say. "I'm sorry you got pulled into that place." "Don't be." Maeve's voice was firm but kind. "I made my choice. That driver I was trying to help back in 1987, he didn't make it. But I've helped dozens of others since then, including you. That has to count for something." "It does," Ronan assured her. "It counts for everything. You saved my life. And you honored that by learning to protect yourself and helping others." There was approval in Maeve's voice. "That's all any of us can do, really. Pass along the knowledge, help the next driver, keep as many people safe as we can." Ronan wanted to ask so many questions. What was it like existing on the Phantom Road? Could she ever escape? Did she have any awareness of the real world she'd left behind? But before he could formulate the words, Maeve spoke again. "I can't talk long. Maintaining this connection to the real world takes energy I don't have much of. But I wanted you to know that you're doing good work, Ronan. Keep watching out for the signs, keep helping other drivers, and stay safe out there. The road is always hungry, but knowledge and vigilance can keep you off its menu." "Thank you, Maeve, for everything." "You're welcome. And Ronan? The next time you're near mile marker 127, drive past it without looking. Don't give that place any of your attention or energy. That's the best way to keep it from pulling you back." The radio went silent after that, leaving Ronan alone with his thoughts in the darkness of the rest area. He sat there for a long time, processing the conversation and everything it implied. Maeve was still out there, still helping, still fighting against the Phantom Road in her own way. It was both comforting and deeply sad. Ronan's life settled into a new kind of normal over the following year. He continued driving professionally, hauling freight across the northern states and carefully avoiding the connection points listed in the guide's notebook. He became meticulous about route planning, always choosing highways that would keep him far from mile marker 127 and the other dangerous locations scattered across the map. But the Phantom Road was never far from his thoughts. Ronan found himself becoming the guide for other drivers who'd had similar experiences. His screen name, Night Driver 23, became known in certain circles as someone who could be trusted with impossible stories. Someone who wouldn't dismiss claims of phantom exits and roads that led to nowhere. Ronan received messages from truckers all over the country, some sharing experiences that matched his own so closely it was eerie. Others described variations, different manifestations of whatever force created the Phantom Roads. A driver in Oregon who'd encountered a truck stop that served food from the 1950s and wouldn't let him pay with modern currency. A woman in Texas who'd found herself driving the same 10-mile stretch of highway for 6 hours straight, unable to escape the loop until dawn broke. Each story added to Ronan's understanding, but also deepened the mystery. The Phantom Road wasn't just one anomaly in North Dakota. It was a network, a web of impossible spaces that touched the real world at specific points. And the more Ronan learned, the more he realized how little anyone truly understood about what was happening. 6 months after his conversation with Maeve at the Montana rest area, Ronan was assigned a delivery that made his stomach drop when he saw the road. The shipment was agricultural equipment going from Minnesota to eastern Montana, and the most efficient route would take him right past mile marker 127 on I-94. His dispatcher had already filed the route plan, and changing it would raise questions Ronan didn't want to answer. Ronan considered turning down the job, but he'd built a reputation for reliability, and he didn't want to damage that over what would seem like irrational superstition. He decided he would take the route, but be extra vigilant when passing through that section of North Dakota. He would drive straight through without stopping, keep his eyes on the road ahead, and not give the Phantom Road any opportunity to pull him in. The day of the delivery started normally enough. Clear weather, light traffic, good road conditions. Ronan made excellent time through Minnesota and into North Dakota, his truck running smoothly and his cargo secure. But as he approached the section of highway near mile marker 127, Ronan felt his anxiety building. His hands were sweating on the steering wheel, and he found himself checking his mirrors compulsively. Mile marker 125 passed on his right, then 126. Ronan's heart was pounding now, his breath coming faster. He told himself it would be fine, that he just needed to drive past and keep going. The phantom road only appeared to those who took the exit, who went looking for it. As long as he stayed on the interstate, he would be safe. Mile marker 127 appeared ahead, and Ronan forced himself to look straight ahead, not at the roadside where the scenic overlook exit had once existed. He maintained his speed at exactly 65 miles per hour, his truck's cruise control locked in. The mile marker passed on his right, just a green sign like any other. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong. But as Ronan checked his rearview mirror, he saw something that made his blood turn to ice. Behind him, clearly visible in the late afternoon sun, was an exit ramp. The scenic overlook exit was there, exactly where it shouldn't be, with a truck pulling onto it. An older model truck that Ronan couldn't quite make out clearly in the distance. Ronan's first instinct was to pull over and warn the driver on his CB, but he remembered Maeve's words about not giving the phantom road any attention or energy. He also remembered the guide's warning that the road had a stronger claim on him now. Stopping to help, getting involved, that could be exactly what the road wanted. So Ronan kept driving. He watched in his mirrors as the exit ramp and the truck disappeared behind him, swallowed by the distance and the curve of the highway. He felt like a coward for not trying to help, but he also knew that self-preservation wasn't cowardice. It was survival. Mile marker 128 passed. Then 129, Ronan allowed himself to relax slightly. He'd made it past the danger zone without incident. The phantom road had been there, had been active, but it hadn't caught him. That was something. But 20 miles later, Ronan's relief turned to confusion and then fear. His GPS showed him approaching mile marker 150, but the marker that appeared on the roadside read 127. Ronan's stomach dropped. He checked his odometer, his GPS, his position on the map. Everything showed he should be 20 miles past that marker. But there it was again, the green reflective sign showing the number that had become a source of nightmares. Ronan's mind raced through the possibilities. Had he somehow turned around without realizing it? Was his GPS malfunctioning? Or was the phantom road pulling him in despite his efforts to avoid it? He looked for the exit ramp, but saw nothing except empty prairie on both sides of the highway. The next mile marker showed 128, then 129. Ronan's GPS synced back up with the physical markers, showing him continuing west as he should be. He told himself it had been a mistake, a single marker that had somehow been labeled incorrectly. But deep down, he knew better. The phantom road had reached out for him, had made its presence known. It was a warning, or perhaps a reminder that he was never truly safe from it. Ronan completed his delivery to Montana without further incident, but the experience left him shaken. The phantom road was getting bolder, more aggressive in its attempts to reclaim him. Simply avoiding the known connection points wasn't enough anymore. The road could reach out and touch him anywhere, could make mile markers appear where they shouldn't be. When Ronan returned to Minnesota, he found a package waiting for him at his home. There was no return address, no indication of who had sent it. Inside was a hand-drawn map, more detailed than the guide's notebook, showing connection points across North America. There were hundreds of them, far more than Ronan had suspected, and someone had circled several locations in red ink, with a note that read, These are becoming active. Avoid at all costs. Ronan recognized the handwriting from the guide's notebook. Apparently, the network of people tracking the Phantom Road was more organized than he'd realized. Someone was monitoring the connection points, watching for changes in their behavior. And whoever it was thought Ronan needed to know about the spreading danger. That night, Ronan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed next to his wife, listening to her breathing and thinking about all the drivers who hadn't made it home. Dalton Cresthaven and his family who never got closure. Maeve Lorigan, trapped in some liminal space between worlds, still trying to help people decades after her disappearance. The guide's brother and countless others who'd taken wrong exits and never returned. Ronan got up and went to his office, where he'd been keeping his research on the Phantom Road. He pulled out the folder with newspaper articles, printed forum posts, and his own detailed account of his experience. He'd been documenting everything, but to what end? Who would believe any of it? And even if they did, what could be done about a phenomenon that defied every law of physics and logic? As Ronan sat at his desk in the darkness, his CB radio crackled to life. He kept one in his home office, an old habit from his early days of trucking. The voice that came through was one he'd never heard before, male and urgent. This is a warning to all drivers currently monitoring this channel. The Phantom Road network is expanding. Multiple connection points activated in the past 72 hours across Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming. If you're on the road, be vigilant. Watch for mile markers that repeat, exits that don't match your GPS, rest areas that feel wrong. The activity level is higher than we've ever recorded. Ronan grabbed his microphone. This is Ronan Keltner. Who is this? How do you know about the Phantom Road? There was a pause, then a different voice came on. This one was familiar, warm, despite the static. Hello, Ronan. It's good to hear your voice again. Maeve? Ronan's hand tightened on the microphone. What's happening? What does he mean the network is expanding? It means what it sounds like. Maeve's voice was tense in a way Ronan had never heard before. The Phantom Road has always been there, touching our world at specific points. But something's changed. New connection points are opening up, and the existing ones are becoming more aggressive about pulling in drivers. We don't know why, but the activity is accelerating. We? Ronan asked. Who's we? The ones who got pulled in and never made it back out, Maeve said quietly. We exist in the spaces between. We can see things that those in the real world can't, and what we're seeing right now is concerning. The boundary between the Phantom Road and the real highway system is getting thinner. Another voice joined the conversation, older and gravelly. Ronan Keltner, this is Dalton Cresthaven. I've heard about you from Maeve. You found my truck. Ronan has felt dizzy, his sense of reality tilting. You're alive? You've been alive this whole time? Alive isn't quite the right word, Cresthaven replied. We exist, but not the way we used to. The Phantom Road took us, but it didn't destroy us. We're part of it now, or maybe it's part of us. The distinction doesn't matter much anymore. What matters is warning drivers like you about what's coming. More voices joined in, a chorus of drivers from different eras and different locations. Some identified themselves, others remained anonymous. But they all shared the same message. The Phantom Road was changing, growing stronger, and the number of drivers being pulled in was increasing. What can I do? Ronan asked, feeling helpless. How do I protect myself and warn other drivers without sounding insane? You keep doing what you've been doing, Maeve said. Document everything. Share information with other survivors. Build the network of living drivers who understand the danger. And most importantly, stay alert. The Phantom Road will try for you again, Ronan. You went too deep, saw too much. It won't give up easily. The voices began to fade, static overwhelming the signal. Ronan called out for Maeve, for Cresthaven, for any of them. But the radio had gone silent again, leaving him alone in his office with nothing but the hum of electronics and the weight of impossible knowledge. Ronan didn't go back to bed that night. Instead, he spent the hours until dawn updating his documentation, adding the new information to his records. He marked the recently activated connection points on his map in red ink, cross-referencing them with recent reports of missing truckers he'd found in online databases. The pattern was unmistakable. Disappearances were increasing, concentrated around the connection points but spreading to new areas. Whatever the Phantom Road was, it was growing more powerful. And Ronan had a sinking feeling that his first encounter with it wouldn't be his last. Over the following weeks, Ronan became obsessed with tracking the Phantom Road's expansion. He created spreadsheets, plotted data points, analyzed reports from truckers who'd experienced anomalies on the highway. He reached out to more survivors, building a network of drivers who'd encountered the impossible and lived to document it. But the more Ronan learned, the more he realized how little control anyone had over the situation. The Phantom Road operated by its own logic, following patterns that seemed random, but might follow rules no human could comprehend. Drivers were being taken with increasing frequency, and there was no authority, no government agency, no organization that could or would address the problem. Ronan tried once to report his findings to the Department of Transportation, hoping that official acknowledgement might lead to warnings or safety measures. The bureaucrat he spoke with was polite but dismissive, suggesting that Ronan was conflating unrelated missing persons cases and seeing patterns where none existed. When Ronan persisted, he was politely told that if he continued making unfounded claims, it could affect his commercial driver's license status. So Ronan fell back on the grassroots network, sharing information through trucker forums and private messages. Some drivers listened and took precautions. Others dismissed him as a conspiracy theorist or someone who'd spent too much time alone on the road. But enough people were paying attention that Ronan felt like he was making a difference, however small. 3 months after the CB radio warning, Ronan was driving through Wyoming on a clear summer night. He was taking a route that avoided all known connection points, keeping to highways that had shown no Phantom Road activity. The drive should have been routine, uneventful. But around 2 in the morning, Ronan's headlights caught something that shouldn't have been there. A truck was parked on the shoulder ahead, hazard lights flashing. As Ronan approached, he could see it was an older model, probably from the early 2000s. A figure stood next to the driver's door, waving for help. Every instinct Ronan had developed told him to keep driving. Stopping to help stranded motorists was basic trucker courtesy, but stopping for the wrong vehicle could mean never leaving the Phantom Road. Ronan slowed slightly, trying to get a better look at the truck and the person flagging him down. In the glow of his headlights, Ronan could see the truck more clearly. It was covered in road dust but looked solid and real. The person waving was a woman, probably in her 40s, wearing jeans and a truck stop t-shirt. Nothing about the scene screamed danger or supernatural threat. It looked like a legitimate breakdown, a driver in genuine need of help. Ronan made a split-second decision. He couldn't live his life in constant paranoia, unable to help anyone for fear they might be part of the Phantom Road. He pulled over behind the truck and grabbed his CB radio before getting out. "This is Ronan Keltner. Stopped to assist a stranded driver on I-80 westbound near mile marker 214 in Wyoming. If anyone's monitoring this channel, please acknowledge." The radio crackled, and Maeve's voice came through immediately. "Ronan, what are you doing? That's a new connection point. It activated less than a week ago. Don't get out of your truck." But Ronan was already out, walking toward the stranded driver. The woman turned to face him, and Ronan could see the relief on her face. She looked normal, solid, real. No black eyes, no strange movements, nothing to suggest she was anything other than what she appeared to be. "Thank you so much for stopping," the woman said. "My truck just died, and I've got a load of frozen food that's going to spoil if I can't get moving soon. Do you have jumper cables or know anything about electrical systems?" Ronan studied her carefully, looking for any sign that this was a trap. But the woman seemed genuine, and her truck looked like it had simply suffered a mechanical failure. "I can take a look," Ronan said cautiously. "What happened exactly?" "Everything just shut down," the woman explained, walking him toward her cab. "Lights, engine, everything. I thought maybe the battery, but I'm not sure." As they approached the truck, Ronan noticed something that made him stop cold. There was frost on the windows despite the warm summer night. Not much, just a thin layer of condensation that had frozen somehow. And when Ronan looked more closely at the truck's tires, he could see they were sitting at slightly wrong angles, as if the vehicle wasn't quite making full contact with the road surface. "What's your name?" Ronan asked, taking a step back. The woman smiled, and in that smile Ronan saw something shift. Her eyes remained normal, but there was something wrong with the way her face moved. "Does it matter? Names are just labels for things that used to be. I was someone once. Now I'm what the road needs me to be." Ronan turned and ran back toward his truck. Behind him, he could hear the woman's footsteps, but they sounded wrong. Too heavy, too deliberate. Like someone walking in a dream or moving through water. Ronan didn't look back. He reached his cab, climbed inside, and locked the doors. The woman was standing right outside his window now, her palm pressed against the glass. "You can't run forever, Ronan. The road knows you. It's tasted you. Sooner or later, you'll be one of us." Ronan fired up his engine and pulled away, his tires squealing on the asphalt. In his rearview mirror, he could see the woman still standing there, watching. And behind her, more figures were emerging from the darkness. Drivers who'd been taken who now served as bait for the Phantom Road's hunger. Ronan drove for 3 hours straight, putting as much distance as he could between himself and that connection point. His hands were shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Maeve's voice continued to come through on his CB, talking him through it, keeping him anchored to reality. "You did the right thing, Ronan. You recognized the signs and got out of there. That's all any of us can do." "How long?" Ronan asked, his voice hoarse. "How long can I keep running from this thing before it catches me?" Maeve was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. Some drivers manage to stay ahead of it for years. Others get pulled back in quickly. But Ronan, you need to understand something. The Phantom Road isn't evil. It's not trying to hurt you. It's just hungry, and it doesn't understand the difference between feeding and destroying." "That's supposed to make me feel better." "No," Maeve admitted. "It's just supposed to help you understand what you're dealing with. The road is a force of nature, like a tornado or a flood. You can't reason with it or negotiate. You can only try to stay out of its path." Ronan had finally stopped at a truck stop in Utah, well away from any known connection points. He was exhausted, drained by fear and adrenaline, but he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that woman's face, saw the hunger in her smile, saw the other figures emerging from the darkness. Ronan called his wife from the truck stop payphone, something he rarely did on the road. He didn't tell her what had happened, didn't want to worry her with impossible stories. He just needed to hear her voice, to be reminded that there was a normal world waiting for him when he got home. "Are you okay?" his wife asked, picking up on the strain in his voice. "You sound tired." "I'm fine," Ronan lied. "Just a long drive. I'll be home in a few days." After the call, Ronan sat in his truck and looked at the map the guide had sent him. The red circles marking active connection points seemed to be multiplying, spreading across the country like a disease. Ronan wondered how long it would be before there were no safe routes left, before the Phantom Road touched every major highway in North America. His CB radio crackled again, and this time it was a voice Ronan didn't recognize. Young, male, terrified. "Is anyone out there? I'm lost. I took an exit that I can't find my way back from. There's a rest area here, but nobody's around, and I keep seeing the same mile marker over and over. Please, someone help me." Ronan grabbed his microphone, ready to respond, to offer guidance. But before he could speak, Maeve's voice cut in. "I've got this one, Ronan. You rest. I'll talk him through it." Ronan listened as Maeve began guiding the lost driver, her voice calm and professional despite the impossibility of the situation. He wondered how many drivers she'd helped over the decades, how many she'd saved from becoming permanent residents of the Phantom Road. And he wondered how many she'd failed to save, how many voices she'd heard fade into static and silence as the road claimed them forever. Ronan completed his delivery to Utah and headed back home to Minnesota, this time taking a route that added 2 days to his trip but avoided all the high-risk areas on his map. His dispatcher complained about the inefficiency, but Ronan didn't care. Survival was more important than efficiency. When Ronan finally pulled into his driveway at home, he sat in his truck for a long time before going inside. He looked at his house, at the normal suburban neighborhood around him, at the people going about their everyday lives with no idea that impossible roads existed just beyond the edge of their awareness. Ronan knew he couldn't keep driving forever. The Phantom Road was getting stronger, more aggressive, and eventually it would catch him. The only question was when. But until that day came, he would keep documenting, keep warning other drivers, keep building the network of survivors who understood the truth. That night, Ronan added a new entry to his notebook. He documented the encounter in Wyoming, the woman who'd been bait, the figures emerging from darkness. He included every detail he could remember, knowing that someday this information might help another driver recognize the signs and escape. As Ronan wrote, his CB radio in the office crackled one more time. No words this time, just static. But underneath the static, Ronan could hear something. Voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The choir of drivers who'd been taken by the Phantom Road, who existed now in that impossible space between reality and nightmare. And somewhere in that chorus, Ronan thought he could hear his own voice, calling out from a future that might already be written. A future where he would join Maeve and Dalton and all the others, helping lost drivers from the wrong side of reality. Ronan shut off the radio and closed his notebook. Tomorrow, he would need to decide whether to keep driving or find a new career, whether the risk was worth the life he'd built around the highway. But tonight, he was home and safe, even if that safety was temporary. Outside his office window, Ronan could see the street lights of his neighborhood. Normal lights, marking normal roads, in a world that was far less normal than most people would ever know. And somewhere out there in the darkness, on highways and interstates across the continent, the Phantom Road waited. It was patient. It was hungry. And it remembered every driver who'd touched it and escaped. Ronan knew, with the certainty that comes from direct experience with the impossible, that this wasn't over. It would never really be over. The Phantom Road had tasted him once, and sooner or later it would call him back. The only question was whether he'd recognize the call before it was too late. Macklin Dorsey had been driving professionally for 23 years, and in that time he'd developed an almost supernatural sense for when weather was about to turn dangerous. It wasn't anything mystical, just decades of reading cloud formations, watching wind patterns, and paying attention to the subtle signs that separated experienced drivers from the ones who ended up in ditches. So, when Macklin saw the sky over eastern Montana that February afternoon in 2022, every instinct he'd developed over 2 decades screamed at him to find shelter and wait it out. The clouds were the color of old bruises, hanging low and heavy with a weight that seemed to press down on the landscape. The temperature had been dropping steadily all day, and the wind was picking up in a way that suggested the ice storm the Weather Service had been warning about was going to be worse than predicted. Macklin was hauling construction materials from Billings to Glendive, a route he'd driven hundreds of times. Normally, it was a straightforward run, 4 hours of mostly empty highway through ranch country and small towns that barely qualified as dots on a map. But with the ice storm rolling in, that straightforward run was about to become a test of skill and nerve. Macklin had 2 options. He could pull over at the next truck stop and wait out the storm, losing maybe 12 to 24 hours of schedule time. Or he could push through and try to make his delivery before conditions got too bad. The customer was expecting the materials for a construction project that had already been delayed by weather, and Macklin's dispatcher had made it clear that getting this load through on time was a priority. Against his better judgment, Macklin decided to push through. He had chains for his drive wheels, decades of experience driving in winter conditions, and enough confidence in his skills to think he could handle whatever the storm threw at him. It was a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. The ice started falling about 40 miles east of Billings, just as Macklin merged onto Highway 94. It wasn't the hard pellets of sleet or the soft flakes of snow, but that worst kind of winter precipitation. Freezing rain that coated everything it touched in a layer of transparent death. Within minutes, the highway transformed from a merely wet surface to a skating rink. Macklin slowed to about 30 miles per hour, his chains biting into the ice and providing just enough traction to keep his rig moving forward. The traffic around him was light, just a few cars and one other semi that Macklin could see in the distance ahead. Most people had the good sense to stay off the roads when weather looked like this. About 15 miles into the ice storm, Macklin's CB radio crackled to life with an alert from the Montana Highway Patrol. Interstate 94 was being closed due to hazardous conditions. All commercial vehicles were being directed to exit at the next available ramp and seek shelter. The closure was effective immediately. Macklin acknowledged the alert and started looking for exit signs. But he was in one of those long stretches between towns, with nothing but ranch land on both sides of the highway. The next exit wouldn't come for another 10 miles, and Macklin wasn't sure he could safely maintain his speed for that long in these conditions. That's when he saw the brake lights ahead. The semi he'd been following was slowing down, hazard lights flashing. Macklin eased off his accelerator and watched as the truck ahead started to fishtail. The driver was clearly losing control, the trailer swinging out to the left while the cab tried to maintain course. It was the beginning of a jackknife, and Macklin had seen enough of them to know how this would end. The truck ahead went fully sideways, blocking both lanes of the westbound highway. The trailer slid across the ice with an almost graceful momentum, metal shrieking against asphalt, until the whole rig came to rest at a 45-degree angle across the road. Smoke or steam was rising from somewhere around the cab, and Macklin could see the driver's door was already open. Macklin brought his own truck to a careful stop about 100 yards back from the jackknifed rig. He grabbed his CB radio and reported the accident to Highway Patrol, giving them his location and the condition of the other truck. The dispatcher acknowledged and said they'd send a trooper as soon as conditions allowed, but warned that response times were going to be delayed due to the number of accidents happening across the state. Every professional instinct Macklin had said to stay in his truck and wait for emergency services. Getting out in an ice storm, approaching an accident scene where there could be fuel spills or other hazards, that was a good way to get hurt. But Macklin could see a figure moving near the jackknifed truck, presumably the driver, and he couldn't just sit there if someone needed help. Macklin pulled on his heavy jacket, grabbed his flashlight and climbed down from his cab. The ice hit him immediately. Needles of freezing rain driven by wind that cut through his clothes like they weren't there. The road surface was a nightmare, so slick that Macklin had to move in tiny, shuffling steps to avoid falling. As Macklin approached the jackknifed truck, he called out, "Driver, are you okay? Do you need help?" But there was no response. The figure he'd seen from his cab was nowhere in sight now, and the driver's door was hanging open, swinging slightly in the wind. The truck itself was a Freightliner, probably 10 or 12 years old based on the body style. The company markings on the trailer had been worn away by weather and time, leaving just faint ghost letters that Macklin couldn't make out in the poor light. The whole rig had that neglected look that came from being run hard and maintained minimally. Macklin approached the open driver's door carefully, using his flashlight to peer inside the cab. What he saw made him stop short. The cab was empty, but it looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. The driver's seat was pushed back as if someone had just gotten up. The keys were still in the ignition, though the engine was off. A CB radio microphone dangled from its cord, swinging gently. But what caught Macklin's attention was the paperwork scattered across the dashboard and passenger seat. Logbooks, delivery sheets, fuel receipts, all of it looking water-damaged and old despite being inside the supposedly sealed cab. Macklin picked up one of the delivery sheets and examined it in his flashlight beam. The date on the sheet was February 18, 2019. 3 years ago, almost to the day. The delivery origin was Billings, Montana, and the destination was Glendive, the same route Macklin was running. The driver's name on the sheet was listed as Ira Bellwether. Macklin set the sheet down and looked around the cab more carefully. There were personal items that suggested the driver had been living out of this truck for a while. A sleeping bag in the berth, a cooler with what looked like old food containers, a shaving kit on the dashboard. But everything had that same quality of being abandoned for longer than just a few minutes. Macklin backed away from the truck and looked around the accident scene. The ice was falling harder now, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet. He couldn't see his own truck anymore through the curtain of freezing rain, and there was still no sign of the driver who should have been here. "Hello?" Macklin called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Is anyone here? I'm a trucker. I stopped to help. If you're injured, call out so I can find you." The only response was the howl of the wind and the steady patter of ice hitting metal and asphalt. Macklin made his way around the jackknifed trailer, checking the ground for any sign of the driver. But the ice was coating everything so quickly that any footprints or drag marks would have been obscured within minutes. As Macklin completed his circuit of the truck, he noticed something odd about the way it had come to rest. The jackknife pattern was wrong somehow. The trailer was angled across the road in a way that didn't match the direction the truck had been traveling. It was as if the rig had jackknifed while going in the opposite direction, which made no sense given that Macklin had been following it westbound. Macklin climbed up on the trailer's running board to get a better look at the cargo area. The doors were sealed, but through a gap in the seam he could see that the trailer was mostly empty. Just a few pallets near the front, wrapped in plastic that looked yellowed and deteriorated. For a truck supposedly making a delivery run, the load was suspiciously light. A sound behind Macklin made him turn quickly, nearly losing his balance on the icy running board. But there was nothing there, just the empty highway and the falling ice. Macklin was starting to feel deeply uneasy about this whole situation. Something was wrong here, beyond just the accident and the missing driver. Macklin made his way back to the cab and checked the paperwork again. He found a logbook and flipped through it, looking for recent entries. What he found didn't make sense. The logbook showed entries dating back weeks, but the most recent one was from February 18, 2019. The same date as the delivery sheet, 3 years ago. According to the log entries, Ira Bellwether had been making regular runs between Billings and Glendive, hauling various construction materials and equipment. The entries were detailed and professional, exactly the kind of documentation you'd expect from an experienced driver. But they all stopped on February 18, 2019, with a final note that read, "Ice storm conditions. Highway closed. Taking service road detour." Macklin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He looked at the date on his phone, February 16, 2022. 2 days before the 3rd anniversary of Ira Bellwether's last log entry. And here was Bellwether's truck, jackknifed on the highway in another ice storm, looking like it had been here for years instead of the few minutes Macklin had watched it slide off the road. Macklin tried his CB radio again, calling Highway Patrol to report what he'd found, but the radio was picking up nothing but static now. He tried his cell phone, but there was no signal. The ice storm was getting worse, and Macklin was cut off from any kind of help or information. That's when Macklin noticed the headlights approaching from behind. Relief washed over him. It had to be a highway patrol trooper or maybe another trucker who'd been caught by the road closure. Either way, Macklin wasn't alone out here anymore. But as the headlights got closer, Macklin's relief turned to confusion. The vehicle wasn't a patrol car or a modern truck. It was another semi, and even from a distance Macklin could tell it was old. The headlight configuration was wrong, the sound of the engine was wrong, everything about it felt like it was from a different era. The truck pulled up behind Macklin's rig and stopped. Macklin waited for the driver to emerge, but the cab remained dark and still. The engine was running, he could hear it idling, but no one got out, no hazard lights came on, no indication that the driver was preparing to help or even acknowledging the situation. Macklin walked toward the new arrival, waving his flashlight to get the driver's attention. But as he got closer, he could see that the cab appeared to be empty. The truck was running with no one behind the wheel, or at least no one Macklin could see through the ice-covered windshield. Macklin's unease was rapidly turning into fear. Nothing about this situation made sense. The jackknifed truck with paperwork from 3 years ago. The missing driver. And now this driverless truck that had appeared out of the ice storm. Macklin's rational mind tried to find explanations, but the part of him that had learned to trust his instincts was screaming at him to get back in his own truck and get away from here. As Macklin backed away from the mysterious truck, he heard an engine sound from ahead. More headlights were approaching from the west, from the direction the jackknifed truck had been traveling. Another semi, moving slowly through the ice storm, its lights cutting through the freezing rain. This truck didn't stop. It passed the accident scene at maybe 20 miles per hour, close enough that Macklin could make out the details. It was another old rig, probably from the 90s or early 2000s. And like the truck behind Macklin's rig, this one appeared to have no driver visible in the cab. Macklin stood in the middle of the highway, ice coating his jacket and hat, watching as the driverless truck disappeared into the storm ahead. His mind was racing, trying to process what he was seeing. Was he hallucinating? Had he hit his head without realizing it? Was the cold affecting his judgment? But the trucks were real. Macklin could hear their engines, see their lights, feel the vibration in the ground as they passed. This wasn't a hallucination. Something impossible was happening on this highway, and Macklin was caught in the middle of it. Macklin made a decision. He would get back in his truck, turn around if possible, and get away from this stretch of highway. Whatever was happening here, he wanted no part of it. He'd break company policy, abandon his delivery schedule, do whatever it took to get back to somewhere that made sense. But as Macklin turned to head back to his truck, he saw that his path was blocked. More trucks had appeared, at least 4 of them that he could count, all arranged in a loose circle around the accident scene. Their headlights created overlapping pools of light in the darkness, and their engines idled with a synchronized rhythm that was deeply unsettling. Macklin was surrounded by driverless trucks on an ice-covered highway in the middle of a storm, with no way to call for help and no clear path to escape. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Macklin remembered stories other drivers had told him over the years. Stories about phantom trucks and ghost convoys, about drivers who'd disappeared on lonely highways and were never seen again. Macklin had always dismissed those stories as tall tales, the kind of thing truckers told each other to pass the time during long hauls. But standing here in the ice and darkness, surrounded by impossible vehicles, Macklin was starting to think those stories might have been warnings instead of entertainment. The CB radio in the jackknifed freightliner suddenly crackled to life, the sound cutting through the wind and ice. A voice came through, distorted and faint, but clearly trying to communicate. Macklin moved closer to the open cab door, straining to hear the transmission. "This is Ira Bellwether calling for assistance. I've jackknifed on Highway 94, eastbound near mile marker 87. Ice storm conditions. I need help. Can anyone hear me?" Macklin's blood ran cold. The voice on the radio was calling for help, using the name from the logbook. Ira Bellwether, the driver whose paperwork dated back 3 years. The driver who, according to Macklin's growing suspicion, had disappeared on this same stretch of highway in another ice storm. Macklin grabbed the CB microphone from inside the cab. His hands were shaking, but he keyed the transmit button. "This is Macklin Dorsey. I'm at your location. Where are you? I can help you." The radio was silent for a long moment. Then the voice came back. Clearer this time, but with an edge of desperation that made Macklin's stomach tighten. "I can see your lights. I can see all the lights. But I can't reach you. I've been trying to reach the highway for hours, but I keep ending up back here. The service road, it just keeps looping. I can't get out." Macklin looked around at the circle of trucks surrounding him, their headlights creating an almost theatrical illumination of the accident scene. "What service road? I'm on Highway 94. The jackknifed truck is right in front of me." "No." Bellwether's voice was strained, confused. "No. I took the service road detour when the highway closed. It's been hours, or maybe days, I don't know anymore. Time doesn't work right here, but I can see the highway, I can see the lights. I just can't reach it." Macklin felt reality starting to slip around him like a truck on ice. He was having a conversation with a man who'd disappeared 3 years ago, standing in the middle of a circle of driverless trucks, in an ice storm that felt like it was never going to end. Nothing about this made sense, but it was happening anyway. "Bellwether, listen to me," Macklin said into the microphone. "Where exactly are you right now? What do you see?" The response came after a pause that felt like hours. "I see the highway. I see lights. I see trucks, but I'm not there. I'm on the service road. I'm always on the service road, and I can't get back." The headlights of the surrounding trucks suddenly shifted, their beams converging on a point about 50 yards to the south of the highway. Macklin followed the direction of the lights and saw something he'd missed before. There was a road branching off from the highway, barely visible through the ice and darkness. A service road that Macklin was certain hadn't been there a few minutes ago. Or maybe it had always been there and Macklin just hadn't noticed it until the lights pointed it out. Either way, that road led somewhere, and Macklin had a sinking feeling that it led to wherever Ira Bellwether had been trapped for the past 3 years. Macklin knew he should get in his truck and leave, should ignore the voice on the radio and the mysterious service road and everything else about this impossible situation. But he also knew that if Ira Bellwether was really out there, trapped and calling for help, Macklin might be the only person who could hear him. The question was whether Macklin was willing to risk following that service road to find out, and whether, if he did follow it, he would be able to find his way back. Macklin stood in the ice and wind, staring at that service road illuminated by the convergence of headlights from trucks that shouldn't exist. Every survival instinct he'd developed over 23 years of professional driving told him to walk away, get back in his cab, and find another route out of here, even if it meant backing up for miles on an ice-covered highway. But Ira Bellwether's voice kept echoing through the CB radio, that desperate edge of someone who'd been lost for far longer than any human should have to endure. Macklin had never abandoned another driver in distress, had built his entire career on the unspoken code that truckers looked out for each other on the road. Breaking that code now felt like betraying everything he'd built his life around. Macklin made his decision. He would take his truck onto that service road, find Ira Bellwether if he could, and get both of them back to the highway before this situation got any worse. It was probably the stupidest decision Macklin had ever made, but it was the only one he could live with. Macklin climbed back into his cab and fired up the engine. The familiar rumble of diesel power was reassuring, a piece of normality in a situation that had gone completely sideways. He grabbed his CB microphone and tried once more to raise the highway patrol, but all he got was static and the occasional burst of that strange, synchronized sound, like multiple engines idling in perfect harmony. "Bellwether, this is Macklin Dorsey," he transmitted. "I'm coming to find you. I'm taking my truck onto the service road. Keep talking so I can track your location by the signal strength." There was a pause, then Bellwether's voice came back with something that sounded almost like hope. "You're coming. You're actually coming onto the service road." Another pause, longer this time. Don't do it. I shouldn't have asked for help. This place, it doesn't let go. Once you're on this road, you're part of it." "Too late for warnings," Macklin said, already putting his truck in gear. "I'm not leaving you out there. Just keep talking and I'll follow your signal." Macklin carefully maneuvered his rig toward the service road, the surrounding trucks maintaining their circle but not blocking his path. As he got closer to the turnoff, Macklin could see that the service road looked old, really old. The asphalt was cracked and weathered, with weeds growing through the gaps despite the winter conditions. There were no markings, no signs, nothing to indicate where this road led or why it existed. The transition from highway to service road was jarring. One moment Macklin was on the relatively smooth surface of Highway 94, and the next his truck was rattling over broken pavement that felt like it hadn't been maintained in decades. The ice was even worse here, coating everything in thick layers that suggested this road had been abandoned long before the storm started. The circle of trucks didn't follow him onto the service road. They remained on the highway, their headlights still illuminating the turnoff like markers or warnings. Macklin watched them in his mirrors as he drove away, watched them fade into the distance and the ice storm until they were just dim glows in the darkness behind him. The service road wound through terrain that didn't match what Macklin remembered seeing from the highway. Instead of the flat ranch land that characterized this part of Montana, the road cut through a landscape of small hills and dense brush that seemed wrong for the region. The ice-covered vegetation created weird shadows in Macklin's headlights, shapes that looked almost like figures standing by the roadside. Macklin kept his speed down to about 15 miles per hour, his chains grinding on the ice and his truck swaying slightly on the uncertain surface. He'd driven on bad roads before, logging trails and construction site access routes, but this was different. This road felt like it existed somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't quite connected to the normal world. "Bellwether, you still there?" Macklin called on the CB. "I'm on the service road now. Give me some kind of landmark so I know I'm heading in the right direction." Bellwether's response was immediate, his voice clearer now that Macklin was on the same road. "I can see your lights. You're getting closer. But Dorsey, you need to understand something. Time doesn't work normal here. I've been on this road for what feels like days, but my watch shows it's only been an hour. Or maybe it's been weeks and my watch stopped. I can't tell anymore." Macklin glanced at his own dashboard clock. It showed 4:47 p.m., which matched his watch and his phone. But as he watched, the digital display flickered and jumped to 4:51, then back to 4:47, then forward to 5:03. Time was unstable here, just like Bellwether had said. The road continued to wind through the impossible landscape, and Macklin started noticing other details that were wrong. The telephone poles along the roadside were rotted and leaning at crazy angles, but they still had wires strung between them that hummed in the wind. There were mailboxes at irregular intervals, their numbers faded beyond reading, marking driveways that led to nowhere visible. After what Macklin's truck odometer said was 5 miles, but what felt like much longer, he saw lights ahead. Not headlights, but something else. A diffuse glow that seemed to come from multiple sources, illuminating a section of the service road that opened up into what looked like a small parking area or truck stop. As Macklin got closer, he could see that it was indeed a truck stop, but one that looked like it had been abandoned for years. There was a small building with broken windows and a faded sign that Macklin couldn't read through the ice. Several fuel pumps stood like tombstones in front of the building, their hoses missing and their number displays dark. And parked in the lot were trucks, at least a dozen of them, all looking old and weathered and wrong. And there, in the middle of the lot, was the freightliner that Macklin had seen jackknife on the highway. Except it wasn't jackknifed here. It was parked normally, as if the driver had simply pulled in for a rest stop and never left. The same truck, in 2 places at once, existing in some kind of impossible overlap between the highway and this service road. Macklin pulled into the lot slowly, his headlights sweeping across the other trucks. Most of them were older models, from the 1990s and early 2000s, though a few looked even older than that. They were all covered in ice and dust, windows opaque, giving no indication whether anyone was inside them. Macklin parked his rig near the building and grabbed his flashlight before climbing down. The wind had died down here, or maybe it just couldn't quite reach this place properly. The ice was still falling, but it seemed to drift down almost lazily, instead of being driven by the harsh gusts Macklin had experienced on the highway. "Bellwether," Macklin called out, his voice sounding strange in the muffled quiet of this place. "I'm here at what looks like an old truck stop. Your freightliner is here. Where are you?" A figure emerged from behind the building, moving slowly and carefully on the ice. It was a man, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing a heavy jacket and a trucker cap that had seen better days. His face was weathered in a way that suggested he'd spent too much time in harsh conditions, and his eyes had that 1,000-yard stare that Macklin had seen in soldiers and disaster survivors. "Dorsey," the man said, his voice matching the one Macklin had heard on the CB. "You actually came. I told you not to, but you came anyway." Macklin approached carefully, studying Ira Bellwether in his flashlight beam. The man looked solid and real, not ghostly or transparent like something from a horror movie. But there was something off about him, something in the way he moved, or the way the light hit him that suggested he wasn't entirely present in the same way Macklin was. "How long have you been here?" Macklin asked. "Your logbook showed entries from 3 years ago." Bellwether laughed, but there was no humor in it. 3 years? Is that what the calendar says? I've lost track. Could be 3 days, could be 3 decades. Time loops back on itself here. I've watched the same sunrise happen 5 times in what I thought was the same day. I've driven this service road for hours and ended up exactly where I started. Macklin looked around the abandoned truck stop, at the collection of vehicles that represented other drivers who'd gotten lost on this impossible road. All these trucks, are there other drivers here? There were, Bellwether said quietly. When I first got here, I could see them sometimes. Other drivers walking around, checking their trucks, trying to find a way out. But they faded over time. Or maybe I'm the one fading and they're still real. It's hard to tell the difference anymore. Macklin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. We need to get out of here. Both of us. My truck is right there, fully fueled and ready to go. We'll drive back the way I came and get back to the highway. Bellwether shook his head slowly. I've tried, dozens of times. The service road just loops. You drive for hours and end up back here. Or you think you're making progress. You see the highway lights in the distance and then suddenly you're parked at this truck stop again with no memory of turning around. The road doesn't want to let go. Then we'll find a different way, Macklin insisted. There has to be a connection point, a place where this service road meets the real world. We just have to find it. Bellwether looked at Macklin with something like pity. You don't understand yet. This place exists because of the ice storms. It only connects to the real world when conditions are right, when the weather creates some kind of opening between where we are and where we should be. The rest of the time, we're just here, existing in this loop, waiting for the next storm to give us another chance at escape. Macklin didn't want to believe it, but he couldn't deny the evidence around him. The impossible landscape, the trucks from different eras, the way time behaved differently here. This wasn't just a forgotten service road. It was something else entirely, a pocket of reality that had somehow separated from the normal world. Your truck on the highway, Macklin said. The one that jackknifed. I saw it happen. But it's also here, parked and intact. How is that possible? Echo, Bellwether said. Or maybe the original. I can't tell which is which anymore. The truck exists in both places because the service road exists in both places. Or maybe neither place. The physics of it doesn't make sense, but that doesn't stop it from being real. Macklin walked over to Bellwether's Freightliner and looked inside. It was the same truck he'd investigated on the highway, with the same paperwork and personal items. But here everything looked newer, less weathered. As if this version of the truck was frozen in time at the moment Bellwether first arrived on the service road. I found a logbook in your truck on the highway, Macklin said. It had entries right up until February 18, 2019. What happened that day? Bellwether leaned against his truck, his expression distant with memory. Same thing that's happening now. Ice storm closed the highway and I saw a service road that looked like it would take me around the closure. The GPS showed it connected back to Highway 94, about 20 miles east. So I took it, thinking I'd beat the closure and make my delivery on time. But the service road didn't connect back to the highway. No, Bellwether confirmed. It just kept going, winding through landscape that didn't match the maps. I drove for hours, my fuel gauge dropping, my nerves getting worse. And then I found this truck stop and pulled in to check my GPS and figure out where I'd gone wrong. That's when I realized I couldn't get a signal, couldn't raise anyone on the CB, couldn't find any way to communicate with the outside world. But I heard you on the CB, Macklin pointed out. On the highway, before I came onto the service road. Because you were at the connection point, Bellwether explained. When an ice storm hits and conditions are right, this place can bleed through into the real world just enough for communication. That's when I can reach out, when I can call for help. But it's also when the service road becomes visible to people on the highway, when new drivers can make the same mistake I made. Macklin felt the weight of that statement settle on him. He'd come here to rescue Bellwether, but he might have just ensured his own permanent disappearance. So, every few years, when there's an ice storm, this service road becomes visible and another driver gets trapped? Sometimes more than one, Bellwether said, gesturing at the other trucks in the lot. See that Peterbilt over there? Driver, named Tilda Ransom, got trapped here back in 2015, and that International next to it that's been here since I arrived. I never met the driver, but the registration in the cab says it belonged to a company that went out of business in 2008. Macklin looked at the collection of abandoned trucks with new understanding. Each one represented a driver who'd gotten lost on this impossible road, who'd been trying to do their job or help someone else and ended up trapped in this liminal space between the real world and whatever this place was. There has to be a way out, Macklin said, refusing to accept that he was now permanently part of this collection. You said the service road becomes visible during ice storms. That means there's a connection, a weakness, and whatever separates this place from the real world. We just need to find it and get through before it closes again. Bellwether looked at Macklin with something that might have been respect. You're not going to give up easy, are you? That's good. Hope is what keeps us human in here. Lose that, and you just become part of the road, another echo fading into the background. So help me, Macklin said. You've been here longer. You know how this place works. Where's the connection point? Where do we have the best chance of breaking through? Bellwether thought for a moment, then pointed back the way Macklin had come. The entrance, where you turned off the highway onto the service road. That's the weakest point, the place where the two realities overlap the most. If we can get back there while the storm is still active, while the connection is still open, we might be able to push through. Then let's go, Macklin said, already heading back to his truck. We'll take my rig, since it's got a full tank and fresh chains. We drive back to the entrance and we don't stop no matter what we see or hear. Bellwether followed, but his movements were slow, reluctant. It's not that simple. The service road fights back when you try to leave. It'll show you things, make you doubt what's real. I've seen the highway lights dozens of times, thought I was almost free, only to end up back here with no memory of turning around. Then we'll tie ourselves to reality somehow, Macklin said, his mind racing through possibilities. We'll keep the CB open, try to raise highway patrol or other truckers. Their voices will anchor us to the real world, remind us which direction we're supposed to be going. Macklin and Bellwether climbed into Macklin's cab, and the familiar confines of the truck felt reassuring after the strangeness of the abandoned truck stop. Macklin fired up the engine and felt its reliable rumble, a reminder that some things still worked according to normal rules. As Macklin prepared to pull out of the lot, he noticed movement in his mirrors. The other trucks, the ones that had been sitting silent and abandoned, were starting to show signs of activity. Lights were coming on in cabs, engines were turning over, and in some cases Macklin could see figures moving behind ice-covered windshields. They don't want us to leave, Bellwether said quietly. The other drivers, the ones who've been here longer than me, they've become part of the service road, and the road uses them to keep new arrivals from escaping. Macklin didn't waste time responding. He put the truck in gear and pulled out of the lot, heading back the way he'd come. The service road stretched ahead in his headlights, winding through that impossible landscape of ice-covered brush and rotting telephone poles. Behind them, the other trucks were pulling out of the lot, forming a loose convoy that followed Macklin at a steady distance. They weren't trying to catch up or block the road, just following, watching, waiting for Macklin to fail in his escape attempt. How far back to the entrance? Macklin asked, his hands tight on the wheel. I don't know, Bellwether admitted. Distance doesn't mean the same thing here. Sometimes it feels like miles, sometimes just a few hundred yards. The road stretches and compresses depending on whether it wants to let you go. Macklin's CB radio crackled to life, and a woman's voice came through. It sounded familiar, though Macklin couldn't place it at first. "All drivers on the service road. This is Tilda Ransom. You're not going to make it. The entrance closes when the storm passes, and the storm's already easing up out there. You've got maybe 10 minutes before the connection seals completely, and you're still miles away." Macklin grabbed the microphone. "Ransom?" Bellwether said, "You've been trapped here since 2015. If you know the entrance is closing, help us get there. Help us all get out of here." The response was sad, resigned. "I can't leave anymore, Dorsey. I've been here too long. I'm part of the road now. But I can tell you this. The entrance isn't where you think it is. It's not back the way you came. The road shifted when you drove in. The entrance is always in a different place, and you have to find it before the storm ends." Macklin felt despair trying to creep in, but he pushed it away. "Then tell me how to find it." "Look for the light that doesn't match the others," Ransom's voice said. "The service road is full of false lights, echoes of the real world that lead nowhere. But there's always one light that's different, one glow that comes from the actual highway. Find that, and you find your exit." Macklin scanned the landscape around him, looking for anything that stood out. But everything was ice and darkness, and dim shapes that could have been real or could have been illusions created by this impossible place. The convoy of trucks behind him maintained their steady following distance, their headlights creating a river of light that both guided and haunted Macklin's path. "There," Bellwether said suddenly, pointing to the left. "That light, it's different from the others." Macklin looked where Bellwether was pointing and saw a glow in the distance. It was brighter than the ambient light of the service road, clearer and more focused. It looked like it might be headlights from the highway, real vehicles traveling on real roads. Macklin turned his truck toward that light, leaving the service road and cutting across what appeared to be an open field. The ground was rough and his truck bounced heavily, but the light was getting closer. The convoy behind him followed, but Macklin could see in his mirrors that they were falling back, as if they couldn't follow him all the way to the exit. The light resolved into a familiar shape. It was Highway 94, exactly where Macklin had left it, with the circle of strange trucks still surrounding the spot where Bellwether's jackknifed Freightliner sat. The impossible had become possible. The service road had led back to reality, and Macklin was almost free. But as Macklin's truck approached the highway, the scene ahead began to flicker and shift. One moment it was solid and real, the next it looked like a projection or a mirage. The road was fighting to keep them, trying to make them doubt what they were seeing. "Don't stop," Bellwether urged. "Don't slow down. If you hesitate, the road will pull us back in." Macklin gunned his engine and his truck surged forward, chains biting into ice and rough ground. The highway flickered again, almost fading completely, but Macklin kept his foot down and his eyes fixed on that light. The boundary between the service road and the highway rushed toward them, and then Macklin felt his tires hit smooth asphalt. They were through. They were back on Highway 94, back in the real world, back where the laws of physics and time worked the way they were supposed to. Macklin brought his truck to a stop and sat there shaking, his hands cramping from how hard he'd been gripping the wheel. Bellwether was silent beside him, staring out at the highway with an expression of disbelief. "We made it," he said quietly. "We actually made it out." Macklin looked in his mirrors and saw that the circle of trucks was gone. The jackknifed Freightliner was still there, but the other vehicles had vanished as if they'd never existed. And in the distance, barely visible through the now lightening ice storm, Macklin could see flashing lights approaching. Highway patrol, finally responding to his earlier call for help. They were safe. They were free. But Macklin knew he would never forget the service road, would never stop seeing those abandoned trucks in his mirrors, would never stop hearing the voices of drivers who hadn't made it out. The Montana Highway Patrol trooper who arrived at the scene was a young woman named Officer Garrett, and she looked thoroughly confused by what she found. Two truckers sitting in one cab, both looking shaken and exhausted, next to a jackknifed freightliner that appeared to have been sitting in the ice for years rather than minutes. The ice storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape coated in crystal and a sky that was clearing to reveal stars. "You the one who called in the accident?" Officer Garrett asked Macklin, her flashlight playing across the scene. "Dispatch said you reported a jackknife almost 2 hours ago, but we've been dealing with multiple incidents across the county." Macklin checked his phone and felt his stomach drop. According to his clock, only 45 minutes had passed since he'd first seen Bellwether's truck jackknife. But Officer Garrett was saying it had been 2 hours. Time was still playing tricks, still refusing to work the way it should. "Yes, ma'am," Macklin said, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is the driver of the jackknifed truck, Ira Bellwether. He was shaken up from the accident, so I gave him a ride in my cab to stay warm while we waited for you." Officer Garrett studied Bellwether with her flashlight, and Macklin could see the questions forming in her expression. Bellwether looked wrong somehow, not quite solid in the beam of light. His clothes were outdated, his appearance weathered in a way that suggested more than just a few hours of stress. "Mr. Bellwether, are you injured?" Officer Garrett asked. "Do you need medical attention?" Bellwether shook his head slowly. "No, I'm fine, just cold and tired. Very tired." Officer Garrett walked over to inspect the jackknifed freightliner, and Macklin watched her expression change as she got closer. She circled the truck, her flashlight revealing details that didn't make sense. The ice coating wasn't fresh. The tires were worn beyond what should have been legal. The paint was faded and the chrome was tarnished in a way that suggested years of neglect. "Mr. Bellwether, how long has this truck been sitting here?" Officer Garrett asked, her tone shifting from concern to suspicious. "I'm not sure," Bellwether said honestly. "It jackknifed during the ice storm. That's all I can tell you." Officer Garrett called in the truck's license plate and VIN number, and Macklin could hear the confused responses coming through her radio. The truck was registered to Ira Bellwether, that much was confirmed. But according to the DMV records, Ira Bellwether had been reported missing 3 years ago after failing to complete a delivery run during an ice storm. The truck had never been found, and Bellwether had been presumed dead in a weather-related accident. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Officer Garrett said to Bellwether, her hand moving toward her sidearm. "There's some kind of discrepancy with your identification and this vehicle's registration." Macklin intervened, keeping his hands visible and his tone calm. "Officer, I know this looks strange, but I can explain what happened. Or at least I can try to explain what I think happened." Over the next hour, with additional patrol units arriving for backup, Macklin told the story as carefully as he could. He explained seeing the truck jackknife, stopping to help, finding the old paperwork dated 3 years back. He described the voice on the CB radio and the decision to investigate. But when it came to the service road and the impossible truck stop and the escape back to the highway, Macklin found himself editing the story. He couldn't tell them about the pocket dimension or the time loops or the ghostly convoy of trucks. They'd think he was suffering from hypothermia or exhaustion, and they'd be partly right. Instead, Macklin said he'd found Bellwether wandering on a maintenance road, disoriented and confused, and had brought him back to the highway. The troopers were skeptical but professional. They took statements, ran checks on both Macklin and Bellwether, and tried to piece together a coherent narrative from the contradictory evidence. Bellwether's driver's license was valid, but 3 years out of date. His truck was registered and insured, but the policies had lapsed. His appearance matched his ID photo, but he looked like he'd aged more than 3 years should account for. Eventually, Officer Garrett made a decision. "Mr. Bellwether, I'm going to need you to come with us to the station for further questioning. There are missing person reports filed on you, and we need to verify your identity and circumstances. Mr. Dorsey, you're free to go, but we'll need you to come by the station tomorrow to sign a formal statement." Macklin watched as they loaded Bellwether into the patrol car. Bellwether looked back at him through the window, and in that look Macklin saw a complex mix of gratitude and fear and uncertainty. They'd escaped the service road, but now Bellwether had to face the consequences of having been gone for 3 years. A life left behind, people who'd mourned him, a world that had moved on without him. As the patrol cars drove away, Macklin was left alone on the highway with his truck and the jackknifed Freightliner. The storm had completely passed now, and the night was cold and clear. Macklin walked over to Bellwether's truck one more time, studying it in the starlight. The truck looked different now than it had when Macklin first stopped to help. The ice coating was melting in patches, revealing paint that was more faded than Macklin remembered. The cargo area was still sealed, but Macklin could see through a gap that it was completely empty. No pallets, no cargo, nothing. Just an empty trailer that had been hauling nothing across 3 years of impossible time. Macklin climbed into the cab one last time and looked at the paperwork scattered across the seats. The logbook was still there, still showing entries up to February 18, 2019. But now there were additional pages, blank pages that hadn't been there before. And on one of those blank pages, someone had written a message in handwriting that looked like Bellwether's, but more desperate, more frantic. "If you're reading this, you found me, or you found the truck. It doesn't matter which. What matters is understanding that the service road is real. It exists in the spaces between storms, waiting for drivers who take wrong turns or follow lights that lead nowhere. I've been trapped here for days or weeks or years. Time doesn't matter. What matters is warning others. Don't take unmarked exits. Don't follow service roads that aren't on your GPS. Don't trust lights in the distance during storms. The road is hungry and it's patient, and it will take you if you let it." Below the message was a list of dates and locations. Macklin recognized them as ice storms, major weather events that had hit Montana and the surrounding states over the past decade. Next to each date was a number, and Macklin realized with growing horror that the numbers represented drivers, people who'd gone missing during those storms who'd presumably taken the service road and never made it back. The list was long, much longer than Macklin wanted to believe. Dozens of names and dates representing truckers and other travelers who'd vanished without explanation. Some of the names were familiar, cases Macklin had heard about through the trucking community. Drivers who'd disappeared in weather events, whose trucks had never been found, whose families had been left without closure. Macklin took photos of the pages with his phone, documenting everything before the authorities could seize the truck as evidence. Then he climbed down and walked back to his own rig, feeling the weight of what he'd experienced settling on his shoulders like physical mass. Macklin didn't complete his delivery to Glendive that night. Instead, he drove to the nearest town with a motel and checked in, needing time to process everything that had happened. He called his dispatcher and explained there'd been a delay due to weather and an accident scene, which was technically true, even if it didn't capture the full horror of the experience. In his motel room, Macklin couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the service road in his mind, kept hearing Tilda Ransom's voice on the CB radio, kept thinking about all those abandoned trucks at the impossible truck stop. How many drivers were still trapped there? How many had faded into echoes and shadows, becoming part of the road itself? Macklin pulled out his laptop and started researching. He found news articles about Ira Bellwether's disappearance in 2019, the search efforts, the eventual conclusion that he'd likely died in the storm. He found articles about other missing truckers, scattered across years and states but all sharing a common thread. They disappeared during ice storms, their trucks never found, no evidence of what had happened to them. Macklin created a spreadsheet, cross-referencing the dates from Bellwether's list with news reports and missing person cases. The pattern was undeniable. Every major ice storm in Montana over the past 15 years had been followed by at least one missing trucker report, sometimes more, and in almost every case, the driver had been traveling on Highway 94 or one of the other major routes that cut through the eastern part of the state. Around 3 in the morning, Macklin's phone rang. It was an unknown number, but Macklin answered it anyway. "Hello? Dorsey, it's Bellwether." The voice was quiet, strained. "I'm at the police station in Miles City. They've been questioning me for hours, trying to verify my story. They called my wife, or my ex-wife, I guess. She thought I was dead. My kids thought I was dead. Everyone thought I was dead." "What are they going to do with you?" Macklin asked. "I don't know yet. They're running medical tests, trying to figure out if I have amnesia or if I've been held captive somewhere or what. They don't believe the truth, obviously. How could they? But, Dorsey, I need to tell you something. Something I didn't mention when we were on the service road because I was afraid it would make you turn back." Macklin felt dread building in his stomach. "What is it?" "The service road doesn't just trap you in space," Bellwether said. "It changes you. The longer you're there, the more you become part of it. I could feel it happening to me over the 3 years I was trapped. My memories getting fuzzy. My sense of self starting to blur. If I'd stayed much longer, I would have ended up like Tilda and the others. Just a voice on the CB, a presence that exists to keep the road fed with new victims." "But you got out," Macklin said. "We both did. You're back in the real world now." "Am I?" Bellwether's voice was barely a whisper. "Dorsey, I've been back for hours and I still feel like part of me is on that service road. I keep hearing the other drivers, keep seeing that truck stop in the corner of my vision. What if getting out physically doesn't mean I'm really free? What if the road still has a hold on me?" Macklin didn't have an answer for that. He'd been feeling similar things himself, a sense of disconnection from reality, a feeling that the world around him was slightly wrong or out of sync. "We need to talk to someone who understands this," Macklin said. "Someone who's studied these phenomena or dealt with similar cases." "Who?" Bellwether asked. "Who's going to believe us? This isn't something that gets reported in the news or studied by scientists. It's barely even a legend among truckers. Most people don't know the service road exists, and the ones who do either dismiss it as a story or they're the ones who got trapped and never came back to tell about it." Macklin thought about the list in Bellwether's logbook, about all those missing drivers. Maybe it's time to change that. Maybe we need to warn people, get the word out about what's really happening during these ice storms. "And how do we do that without sounding insane?" Bellwether asked. "I just spent 4 hours trying to explain to police officers why I look 48 instead of 45 and why I can't account for 3 years of my life. They think I'm mentally ill or lying or both. What makes you think anyone else will believe us?" Macklin didn't have a good answer, but he knew he couldn't just go back to driving routes through Montana and pretend the service road didn't exist. He'd seen it, experienced it, barely escaped it. And now he had a responsibility to do something with that knowledge. The next morning, Macklin drove to the police station in Miles City to give his formal statement. He stuck to the edited version of events, the one that didn't include impossible dimensions or time loops. The detective taking his statement was professional but clearly skeptical about the whole situation. You're saying you just happened to find Mr. Bellwether wandering on a maintenance road 3 years after he was reported missing during an ice storm that happened to jackknife his truck in the exact same location where you stopped. I know it sounds unlikely, Macklin said, but that's what happened. The detective studied Macklin for a long moment. Mr. Dorsey, I've been working missing persons cases in this county for 15 years. I've seen a lot of strange things, a lot of cases that don't add up the way they should. And I've learned that sometimes the official explanation and the truth aren't the same thing. Macklin met the detective's eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying that Montana has a lot of empty space and bad weather and roads that don't always behave the way they should. I'm saying that we get reports of missing truckers more often than the statistics would predict, especially during ice storms. And I'm saying that the official reports always conclude it's weather-related accidents, even when we never find the trucks or the bodies. You don't believe the official explanations, Macklin said. The detective leaned back in his chair. I believe that Highway 94 and the roads around it have taken more lives than we can account for. I believe that there are places in this state where normal rules don't seem to apply. And I believe that drivers like you and Mr. Bellwether have seen things that can't be explained in my reports. The detective pulled out a file folder and slid it across the table. This is everything we have on trucker disappearances in eastern Montana over the past 20 years. 47 cases, all unsolved. You can't take this file with you, and I can't officially acknowledge what I'm showing you, but I think you should see it. I think you should know how big this problem really is. Macklin opened the file and felt his blood run cold. 47 cases. 47 drivers who'd vanished. Their trucks never found, their families left with nothing but questions and grief. The cases stretched back to 2003, all clustered around Highway 94 and the surrounding routes. All during ice storms or severe weather events. Each case file had a photo of the missing driver, their personal details, the circumstances of their disappearance. Macklin recognized some of the names from Bellwether's list. Others were new, cases that hadn't been documented in the logbook, but the pattern was unmistakable. What do you want me to do with this information? Macklin asked the detective. I want you to be careful, the detective said. I want you to warn other drivers if you can do it without sounding crazy. And I want you to understand that if you keep driving these routes during winter, you're taking a risk that goes beyond normal weather hazards. Macklin spent the rest of the day in Miles City, talking with Bellwether and comparing notes. Bellwether had been released from police custody but was staying in town while he tried to piece his life back together. His wife, now his ex-wife, had agreed to meet with him but was understandably confused and upset. His children, now 3 years older than when he'd last seen them, didn't know how to process his return. I don't fit in my own life anymore, Bellwether said as they sat in a diner drinking coffee. Everything's moved on without me. My job is gone, my marriage is over, my kids barely remember me. I'm like a ghost who came back to find out everyone's already finished mourning. You could start over, Macklin suggested. New job, new location, fresh start. Could I? Bellwether looked haunted. Dorsey, I still hear them. The other drivers on the service road. Tilda and the others, they're calling to me saying I abandoned them, saying I should come back and help them escape like you helped me. Macklin had been hearing similar things. Voices on his CB radio that shouldn't be there, calling from channels that didn't exist. Static that resolved into words if he listened too carefully. The service road was still trying to pull them back, still exerting some kind of influence even though they'd physically escaped. We need to find a way to close that road, Macklin said, or at least warn people away from it. Those drivers who are still trapped, maybe there's a way to get them out. Or maybe we'd just be condemning ourselves to the same fate, Bellwether said darkly. The road is stronger than we are, Dorsey. It's been there longer than we've been alive, and it'll be there long after we're gone. Fighting it might be noble, but it's probably also suicide. Macklin understood the fear, felt it himself. But he also couldn't shake the image of all those abandoned trucks, all those trapped drivers slowly fading into echoes and shadows. Someone had to do something, and maybe that someone was him. That night, Macklin drove back to the spot where Bellwether's truck had jackknifed. The Freightliner had been towed away by authorities as evidence, but Macklin could still see the marks it had left on the highway. And if he looked carefully at the landscape around him, he could almost see the service road, a faint outline in the darkness where reality seemed slightly thinner. Macklin pulled out his CB radio and tuned it to channel 19. "This is Macklin Dorsey, calling any drivers who might be monitoring this channel. If you're on Highway 94 in eastern Montana and you see a service road or an unmarked exit during an ice storm, do not take it. I repeat, do not take that exit. It leads somewhere you don't want to go and you might not be able to get back." The radio was silent for a moment. Then static filled the channel. And underneath that static, Macklin could hear voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The choir of trapped drivers calling out from the service road, warning him or threatening him or begging for help. Macklin couldn't tell which. One voice rose above the others, clearer and more distinct. It was Tilda Ransom. "Dorsey, you made it out. Good for you. But you should know something. The service road doesn't forget. It marked you when you drove on it, and it marked Bellwether. Sooner or later it'll call you back. And next time you might not escape. Then I'll make sure there isn't a next time," Macklin said into the microphone. "I'll make sure other drivers know to avoid it." Tilda's laugh was hollow, bitter. "You think you're the first to try? We've all tried to warn people, everyone who got trapped and managed to communicate back to the real world. But nobody listens. Nobody believes. They take the service road anyway, thinking they're different, thinking they'll be fine. And then they join us here in the dark, waiting for the next ice storm to give them another slim chance at escape." The static increased, drowning out Tilda's voice and all the others. Macklin sat in his truck on the empty highway listening to the sounds of the impossible road calling to him through his radio. He knew Tilda was probably right. Warning people might not work. The service road would continue to claim victims, would continue to exist in that pocket of broken reality, would continue to trap drivers who made the mistake of taking the wrong exit during the wrong storm. But Macklin also knew he had to try. Had to do something with the knowledge he'd gained and the escape he'd made. Even if it only saved one driver, even if it only prevented one family from losing someone to that hungry road, it would be worth it. Macklin turned off his CB radio and drove back toward Billings, leaving the jackknife site and the invisible service road behind. He had a delivery to complete and a life to get back to. But he also had a mission now, a purpose that went beyond just hauling freight from point to point. He would document everything he'd learned, would compile the missing persons cases and the patterns and the evidence, would share it with other truckers through forums and CB channels and truck stop conversations, would make sure that knowledge of the service road spread as far and wide as possible. It might not be enough to stop the disappearances, but it was better than doing nothing, and maybe, just maybe, it would give some future driver the information they needed to recognize the danger and turn back before it was too late. As Macklin drove through the pre-dawn darkness, he thought about Ira Bellwether trying to rebuild a life that had moved on without him. He thought about Tilda Ransom and all the other drivers still trapped on the service road, existing in that limbo between reality and nightmare. He thought about the families who'd lost loved ones to that impossible place, families who deserved answers they would probably never get. And Macklin made himself a promise. He would keep driving, would keep working, would keep living his life. But he would never forget what he'd seen on the service road, would never stop trying to warn others, would never give up on the possibility that someday, somehow, someone would find a way to close that road forever and free the drivers who were trapped there. It was a small rebellion against the impossible, a refusal to accept that some things couldn't be fought or changed. But it was all Macklin had, and he would hold on to it for as long as he could. Macklin returned to his regular routes, but nothing felt the same anymore. Every time he drove through Montana, especially along Highway 94, he felt the presence of the service road like a weight pressing against the edge of his awareness. It was always there, waiting just beyond the visible spectrum of reality, hungry for the next ice storm to open the connection again. He kept his promise to document everything. Macklin created detailed reports of his experience, cross-referenced the missing persons cases, compiled testimony from families of disappeared drivers. He shared the information carefully through trucker forums, using anonymous accounts and coded language to avoid sounding completely insane. Some drivers dismissed his warnings as paranoia or creative fiction, but others reached out privately, sharing their own strange experiences on Montana highways during winter storms. 3 weeks after his escape from the service road, Macklin received a package at his home address. There was no return address, just a postmark from Miles City, Montana. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note from Ira Bellwether. Dorsey, I couldn't stay in Montana. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that truck stop, heard those voices. My family doesn't understand what happened to me, and I can't explain it without sounding crazy. I'm moving to Arizona, going to try long-haul runs in the desert where there's no ice and no storms. Maybe distance will help, maybe not. But I had to try. The USB drive has recordings I made of the CB transmissions I've been hearing since we escaped. I don't know what to do with them, but I thought you should have them. You're trying to warn people, trying to make a difference. Maybe this will help, or maybe it'll just prove we're both losing our minds. IB. Macklin plugged the USB drive into his laptop and found dozens of audio files. He listened to them with headphones, alone in his home office, and felt ice water running through his veins. The recordings were CB transmissions, voices calling out from the service road. Some were asking for help. Others were warning away potential victims. And some were just screaming, raw sounds of terror and despair that cut through the static like knives. But what made Macklin's hands shake was recognizing voices. Drivers he'd known personally, truckers who'd disappeared over the years. A man named Garrett who'd gone missing in 2017 during an ice storm. A woman called Susan who'd vanished in 2020. Their voices were on these recordings, calling out from the service road, proving they were still there in some form. And at the end of one recording, Macklin heard his own voice. Not a voice he'd transmitted, but a future echo, calling for help from coordinates that matched the service road's location. This is Macklin Dorsey, requesting assistance. I'm trapped on a service road off Highway 94. I can see the highway, but I can't reach it. If anyone can hear this, please help. Please don't let me end up like the others. Macklin stopped the playback and sat in silence, his heart pounding. That message didn't exist yet. He hadn't transmitted it. But there it was, his voice calling from the service road as if his eventual capture was already written in stone, a future that had somehow leaked backward into the present. Macklin called Bellwether immediately. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail. Macklin tried again an hour later, then again the next morning. No answer. He sent text messages, emails, everything he could think of. But Bellwether had gone silent, disappeared into whatever new life he was trying to build in Arizona. Or maybe he'd been pulled back to the service road. Maybe the warning Tilda had given was already coming true, and Bellwether was the first to be reclaimed by that hungry stretch of impossible highway. Macklin tried to push the thought away, tried to focus on his work and his family and the normal aspects of his life. But the service road was always there in the background, a constant presence that colored everything he did. He started avoiding routes through Montana entirely, taking longer paths that added days to his delivery schedules. His dispatcher complained about the inefficiency, but Macklin held firm. He would not drive Highway 94 during winter, would not risk another encounter with the service road. 4 months after his escape, Macklin was at a truck stop in Wyoming when he met another driver who'd heard about his warnings. The man introduced himself as a long hauler who'd been running Montana routes for 15 years, and he wanted to know if Macklin's stories about the service road were real. "Every word," Macklin said. "I was there. I saw it. I barely made it out." The driver studied Macklin's face, looking for signs of deception or mental instability. "I've heard stories like yours before. Drivers who claimed they'd been on roads that don't exist, seen things that can't be real. Most of them ended up quitting the industry or checking into hospitals. You still driving?" "I'm still driving," Macklin confirmed. "Just not through Montana in winter." "Smart," the driver said. "I've lost 2 friends to that highway, both during ice storms. Both vanished without a trace. Their trucks were never found. Their families never got answers. If your warnings can prevent even one more disappearance, you're doing good work." The driver handed Macklin a business card. "There's a group of us who've been tracking these disappearances. Drivers, investigators, even a few academics who study anomalous phenomena. We meet online, share information, try to map the danger zones. Your experience could help fill in some gaps in our understanding, if you're interested." Macklin took the card and felt something like hope kindle in his chest. He wasn't alone in this. There were others who'd noticed the pattern, who were trying to understand and combat whatever force created the service road. Maybe together they could make a difference. That night, Macklin joined the online group and found dozens of people who'd been tracking highway anomalies for years. They had maps showing clusters of disappearances, theories about what caused the phenomena, and documented cases going back decades. The service road off Highway 94 was just one of many dangerous locations they'd identified across North America. The ice storms seemed to be triggers, one researcher explained during a video conference. They create conditions where the boundary between normal space and these pocket dimensions becomes permeable. We've seen similar patterns with severe fog, heavy rain, and other weather events that reduce visibility and isolate travelers. "Can these places be closed?" Macklin asked. "Is there a way to seal them off permanently?" The researcher's expression was grim. "We don't know. These phenomena have been occurring for as long as we have records. Native American tribes in Montana have legends about spirit roads that appear during storms. Settlers in the 1800s reported roads that led nowhere. It's possible these pocket dimensions are natural features of the landscape. Impossible to close because they're not really open in the first place. But we can warn people," another group member said. "We can map the danger zones, identify the conditions that make them active, and spread information that might save lives. It's not perfect, but it's better than letting people drive into these traps blind." Macklin threw himself into the work, contributing his documentation and coordinating with other survivors of highway anomalies. He created detailed maps showing where the service road became accessible during different weather conditions. He compiled a database of missing persons cases that matched the pattern, and he continued to monitor CB channels, listening for voices from the service road, documenting every transmission that came through. 6 months after his escape, Macklin was driving through South Dakota when his CB radio crackled with a familiar voice. It was Bellwether, but he sounded different. Distant, hollow, like he was calling from very far away or from the bottom of a well. "Dorsey, if you can hear this, you need to know something. I tried to stay away, tried to build a new life, but the road wouldn't let me go. It kept calling, kept showing me visions of the truck stop, kept making me hear the other drivers. Last week, I was in New Mexico, hundreds of miles from Montana. When I saw a service road during a dust storm, it looked different. Desert instead of plains, but I knew it was the same thing, the same trap." Macklin grabbed his microphone. "Bellwether, where are you? Are you safe?" "I don't know where I am anymore." Bellwether's voice was fading in and out, static eating at the edges of his words. "I took that desert service road. I thought maybe if I went in voluntarily, if I understood what it wanted from me, I could find a way to break its hold. But Dorsey, it's not just one road. It's a network. All the service roads, all the phantom highways, they're all connected. And once you've been on one of them, you're marked for all of them." The transmission cut out, replaced by static. Macklin tried to raise Bellwether again, cycling through every channel, but there was no response. Bellwether was gone, pulled back into the network of impossible roads that stretched across the continent. Macklin pulled over at the next rest area and sat in his cab, staring at his CB radio. Bellwether's fate was a preview of his own future. The service road wouldn't let them go, would keep reaching out across distance and time until it reclaimed what it had marked as its own. Escape was temporary, a brief reprieve before the inevitable return. But Macklin refused to accept that inevitability. He increased his efforts with the research group, helping to identify and map service roads across multiple states. They found patterns that suggested these phenomena were spreading, or perhaps just becoming more active. New danger zones were appearing, and the frequency of disappearances was increasing. "It's like the boundaries are getting thinner," one researcher said during a meeting. "Climate change, increased storm intensity, something is making these pocket dimensions more accessible. We're seeing reports of phantom roads in places that never had them before." Macklin thought about that network Bellwether had described. All the service roads connected across impossible distances. What if they weren't separate phenomena at all, but different access points to the same underlying anomaly? What if there was one vast pocket dimension that touched the real world at hundreds or thousands of locations, and drivers who entered at any point could potentially exit at any other? It was a terrifying thought, suggesting the problem was far larger and more complex than anyone had realized. But it also offered a possibility. If the network was connected, then maybe there was a central point, a hub where the anomaly was strongest. And maybe, if that hub could be found and somehow disrupted, the entire network could be affected. Macklin shared his theory with the research group, and it sparked intense discussion. Some thought it was worth investigating. Others worried that searching for the hub would just lead more people into the trap. But eventually, they agreed to compile data on all known service road incidents and look for patterns that might indicate a central location. The analysis took months, but eventually a pattern emerged. The incidents clustered around specific geographic features: ancient geological formations, areas with high magnetic anomalies, places where ley lines supposedly intersected according to various esoteric traditions. And at the center of it all, the strongest cluster of incidents, was a remote area in eastern Montana near the Little Rocky Mountains. "This could be it," the lead researcher said. "The hub, the source point, whatever you want to call it. If we're right about the network theory, this is where it all connects. We need to investigate," Macklin said. "During the next major ice storm, we need to be there with equipment to document what happens." "That's dangerous," another group member warned. If this is the hub, the pull would be strongest there. Anyone who goes in might not come back out. Macklin knew the risk, felt it in his bones. But he also knew he couldn't keep running forever. The service road had marked him, would eventually pull him back. Better to face it on his own terms, with preparation and backup, than to be caught by surprise on some random highway during some random storm. 10 months after his initial escape, Macklin was part of a small team that set up monitoring equipment near the suspected hub location in Montana. It was late November, and weather forecasts predicted a major ice storm moving through the area. If their theory was correct, the service road would become highly active during the storm, and they might be able to observe and document the phenomenon from a safe distance. The team consisted of Macklin, 2 researchers with various detection equipment, and a documentary filmmaker who wanted to capture evidence of the phenomenon. They positioned themselves on a hill overlooking Highway 94, with a clear view of the area where the service road was most likely to appear. The storm hit just after sunset, ice falling from a bruised sky and coating everything in layers of crystal. Macklin watched the highway through binoculars as traffic thinned and eventually stopped, drivers heeding the warnings to seek shelter. And then, as the storm reached its peak intensity, Macklin saw it appear. The service road materialized like a photograph developing, faint at first and then growing more solid and real. It branched off from the highway at an angle that defied normal geometry, curving away into a landscape that didn't match the surrounding terrain. The monitoring equipment went haywire, registering electromagnetic anomalies and spatial distortions that shouldn't be possible. "Are you seeing this?" one of the researchers breathed, his voice full of awe and terror. Macklin was seeing it, and more. Through his binoculars, he could see the truck stop in the distance, that impossible collection of abandoned vehicles. He could see figures moving among the trucks, drivers who existed now only as echoes and warnings. And he could see one figure in particular, standing at the entrance to the service road and looking directly at their observation post. It was Bellwether, or what was left of him. The figure had Bellwether's shape and stance, but there was something hollow about it, something that suggested the man Macklin had rescued was mostly gone now, consumed by the service road and transformed into another piece of its machinery. The Bellwether figure raised one hand in a gesture that could have been a wave or a warning, and then he turned and walked back down the service road, disappearing into that impossible landscape. "We need to go down there," Macklin said, lowering his binoculars. "We need to get closer, document this properly." "That's suicide," one of the researchers protested. "If we get too close to the access point during peak activity, we could get pulled in." "Then I'll go alone," Macklin said. He was already moving toward his truck, driven by something he couldn't fully articulate. Maybe it was guilt about Bellwether. Maybe it was the knowledge that he was marked and would end up there eventually anyway. Or maybe it was just the service road itself, exerting its pull on someone who'd escaped once and thought he could escape again. Macklin drove down the hill toward the highway, ignoring the shouts from the research team. He could feel the pull getting stronger as he got closer, a magnetic attraction that seemed to bypass his conscious mind and speak directly to something deeper. The service road wanted him back. It had always wanted him back. And now it was calling with a voice he could no longer resist. Macklin's truck rolled to a stop at the entrance to the service road. The ice storm raged around him, but here at the threshold between realities, everything was still and quiet. Macklin could see the truck stop clearly now, could see the abandoned vehicles and the figures that moved among them. He recognized some of them from photos in missing persons files. Drivers who'd been gone for years, decades, now existing as part of the service road's eternal collection. And standing at the entrance waiting for him was Bellwether, the hollow version, the echo. The thing that had been a man, but was now something else. He smiled at Macklin, a sad and knowing expression that conveyed both welcome and apology. Macklin's hand moved toward the gear shift, ready to put the truck in drive and follow that pull onto the service road. It would be so easy. Just drive forward and accept what had been inevitable since the moment he'd first helped Bellwether escape. Join the collection. Become another warning voice on the CB radio. Exist in that timeless loop until there was nothing left of Macklin Dorsey but memory and echo. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of his family, waiting for him at home. Maybe it was the thought of all the work he'd done to warn other drivers, work that would be wasted if he disappeared. Or maybe it was just stubborn pride, a refusal to let the service road win without a fight. Macklin put his truck in reverse and backed away from the entrance. The pull grew stronger, became almost physical, like hands grabbing at his vehicle and trying to drag it forward. The engine protested, wheels slipping on ice, but Macklin kept his foot on the gas and his truck moving backward. The Bellwether figure's expression changed, the sad smile transforming into something hungrier, more desperate. Other figures emerged from the truck stop, moving toward Macklin's truck with that same hollow quality. They were trying to stop him, trying to keep him from escaping a second time. But Macklin had learned from his first escape. He kept his eyes fixed on the real world behind him, on the hill where the research team was waiting, on the normal highway that led away from this impossible place. He didn't look at the figures approaching his truck, didn't listen to the voices calling his name on the CB radio, didn't let himself be distracted by anything except the act of moving away from the service road. And then, like breaking through the surface of water after being held under, Macklin felt the pull release. His truck surged backward as the resistance suddenly vanished, and he nearly lost control on the ice-covered highway. But he managed to keep the vehicle steady, managed to put distance between himself and the service road, managed to escape for the second time. When Macklin rejoined the research team on the hill, he was shaking so hard he could barely hold the steering wheel. They'd captured everything on video and instruments, had documented the service road's appearance and Macklin's near capture. But Macklin knew the most important documentation wasn't what they'd recorded. It was what he'd learned. The service road could be resisted. The pull was strong, maybe irresistible for some people, but it could be fought. Escape was possible, even for those who'd been marked, even for those who'd been on the road before. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't guaranteed, but it was possible. Over the following months, Macklin worked with the research group to develop protocols for resisting the service road's pull. They created mental exercises, focusing techniques, ways to anchor yourself to reality when the impossible road was trying to draw you in. They shared these techniques with truckers and other travelers, building a network of knowledge and resistance. Did it work? Sometimes. The disappearances continued, but at a slightly lower rate. Some drivers who might have been claimed by the service road managed to resist and escape. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress. And Macklin kept driving, kept working, kept fighting against the inevitability of his eventual recapture. He knew the service road was still out there, still waiting, still hungry. He knew it would keep trying to pull him back, that every ice storm was another opportunity for the impossible to reach into the real world and claim what it considered its own. But Macklin also knew that he would keep resisting for as long as he could, would keep warning others, keep documenting the phenomenon, keep fighting to save drivers from the fate that had claimed Bellwether and so many others. It was a losing battle in the long term, probably. The service road had existed for centuries and would probably exist for centuries more. But in the short term, in the day-to-day struggle of staying free and helping others do the same, Macklin was winning. And that was enough. It had to be enough. 2 years after his first escape, Macklin received a message on the research group's private forum. It was from an account he didn't recognize, and the message was simple. "Thank you. Your warnings saved my life. I saw the service road during an ice storm in Montana. Almost took it because my GPS said it was a shortcut. But I remembered your posts, recognized the signs, and turned back. I'm still here because of you. A grateful driver." Macklin read that message over and over, feeling something like peace settle in his chest. This was why he kept fighting, not because he could save everyone, but because he could save someone. One driver who made it home to their family instead of disappearing into the impossible. One person who didn't have to join the chorus of voices calling from the service road. It was enough, it had to be enough, because the alternative, giving up and accepting the inevitable, meant letting the service road win. And Macklin refused to give it that satisfaction. He would keep driving, keep warning, keep resisting, for as long as he could, for as many people as he could reach, for as long as the service road allowed him to remain in the real world. And when the service road finally called him back, when his resistance finally failed and the pull became too strong to fight, Macklin would make sure his documentation and warnings lived on, would make sure other drivers knew the truth and could protect themselves. The service road might eventually claim him, but it wouldn't claim everyone, not if Macklin had anything to say about it. Late one night, alone in his truck at a rest area in Wyoming, Macklin's CB radio crackled to life with Bellwether's voice. But this time, it wasn't the hollow echo, not the thing the service road had made him into. It was Bellwether himself, or whatever remained of the man beneath the transformation. "Dorsey, I don't know if you can hear this. I don't know if I'm really transmitting or if this is just an echo bouncing around in my own head. But I wanted to say thank you for trying to save me, for not giving up even when I did, for fighting the road even though you know it's probably futile." "I can hear you," Macklin transmitted back, not knowing if the message would reach whatever remained of his friend. The service road isn't evil, Dorsey. That's what I've learned being part of it for so long. It's not malicious or cruel. It's just hungry the way a black hole is hungry. It exists, and it pulls, and it consumes. Not because it wants to hurt anyone, but because that's what it is. That's what it does. "That doesn't make it any less dangerous," Macklin said. "No," Bellwether agreed. "But it means we can't hate it. We can only work around it, avoid it, learn to exist in the same universe without getting pulled in. And that's what you're doing. That's what your warnings and your research and your resistance are all about. Learning to coexist with the impossible." The transmission was fading, Bellwether's voice getting harder to hear through the static. "Keep fighting, Dorsey. Keep warning people. Some of us are beyond saving, but others don't have to be, and that's worth everything." The radio went silent, and Macklin sat alone in his truck, listening to the hiss of empty channels. Somewhere out there, on highways that existed in the spaces between reality, the service road was waiting. Patient, hungry, eternal. But Macklin was still here, still free, still fighting, and that was enough.